Welcome to Infinite History Stories. There is something that happens when you start pulling at the loose threads of American history. At first, it seems harmless. You read a book, maybe watch a documentary, maybe stumble across an old photograph of a stone wall that looks a little too precise, a little too ancient to be what the textbook told you it was. And then you pull a little harder, and another thread comes loose, and another, and before long, you are standing in the middle of something that feels less like history and more like a locked room. One where the door was bolted from the inside, the windows were painted over, and someone left a note on the floor that says, "There is nothing to see here, but there is always something to see. There is always something to find." The deeper you look into the American continent, into its soil and its stone and its silence, the more you realize that the official story, the one that begins with Columbus in 1492, traces a tidy line forward through settlements and battles and founding documents. That story is only the surface. It is a thin layer of paper stretched over something much older, much stranger, and much harder to explain. This is not a documentary about conspiracy theories. This is not a documentary about wild speculation or fringe beliefs. This is something closer to a long, slow walk through the evidence, through the ruins and the bones, and the measurements, and the oral traditions, and the anomalies that trained scientists have documented over more than 2 centuries, evidence that sits in museum basement and government archives and academic journals quietly, waiting for someone to put it all together in one room and ask the obvious question, what happened here before the history we were taught began? Because something did happen, something remarkable. Something that left traces in the landscape so enormous and so precise that we are still struggling to explain them. Something that left behind skull measurements and burial sites and astronomical alignments that do not fit the model we have been given. Something that built cities the size of medieval London in the middle of the American wilderness before any European had set foot on this continent. Something that carved tunnels into mountains and raised earthen monuments taller than buildings and left copper tools in places where copper was not supposed to exist. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. There is something about the deep past, about mysteries that have no clean endings, about questions that trail off into the dark of ancient forests, that loosens the grip of the day and lets the mind drift into something softer, something older, something that reminds you that the world is far bigger and far stranger and far older than your Tuesday morning meeting, or your unpaid bills, or whatever it is that kept you awake last night. Maybe subscribe. Let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always read the comments. Someone in Texas at 2 o'clock in the morning, someone in the Philippines at sunrise, someone in England in the middle of a rainstorm, all of us drifting together into the same ancient darkness. Let us begin. America is old. Older than most people allow themselves to truly feel. We talk about thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and the numbers move through the mind like water through fingers, leaving almost nothing behind. But try to hold one number for a moment, 22,000 years. The oldest confirmed evidence of human habitation on the American continent goes back at least that far, and probably much further, to a time when the ocean was lower and the climate was different, and the land itself looked almost nothing like it does today. 22,000 years. That is not nothing. That is longer than all of recorded human civilization everywhere on Earth. That is enough time for empires to rise and fall a dozen times. That is enough time for languages to be born and die and be completely forgotten. That is enough time for entire ways of life, entire belief systems, entire architectural traditions to develop and flourish and collapse, and leave almost no trace, or almost no trace, in the places we think to look. The story of who first came to the Americas, when they came, and how they got here, is one of the most contested questions in all of science. For most of the 20th century, the official answer was simple. People crossed a land bridge from Asia during the last ice age, roughly 15,000 years ago. They walked across Bingja, that now submerged stretch of land, connecting Siberia to Alaska, and spread south through the continent over the following centuries. This became known as the Clovis First model. named after a site in New Mexico where distinctive stone tools were found in the 1930s. It was a clean story, reassuring in its simplicity. And then the evidence started getting complicated. In the 1970s, a site called Monte Verde in southern Chile was excavated, and what archaeologists found there required an uncomfortable rethinking of everything. Monte Verde showed clear evidence of human habitation going back 14,500 years. That is already problematic enough for the Clovis first model. But the real trouble is where Monte Verde sits. Southern Chile, the southern tip of South America. If people only arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago via Bingia, how did they get to the very bottom of South America just 1,500 years later? The math does not work. The distance does not work. You cannot walk from Alaska to southern Chile in 1,500 years if you are stopping to hunt and gather and establish camps along the way. The continent is simply too large, and Monte Verde is not alone. In 2019, researchers working at a site called Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico announced findings that pushed the timeline back to 30,000 years ago. This was not a minor revision. This was a complete overhaul. 30,000 years. We are talking about a time before the supposed land bridge was even fully accessible. A time when the last ice age had not yet reached its maximum extent. A time that rewrites not just when people arrived in the Americas, but fundamentally how. And if that is not enough, there is the problem of Pedra Ferrada in Brazil. This site contains rock art and what appear to be hearths and stone tools dating back somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 years. The claims made by the Brazilian researchers who excavated Pedra Ferrada have been disputed, debated, and argued about in academic journals for decades, but they have never been fully refuted. The site exists, the dates are real, and if they hold, we are dealing with a North American and South American prehistory that begins so far back in time that everything we thought we knew becomes a starting point, not a conclusion. But the question of when is almost secondary to the question of who, because the physical remains found at some of the oldest American archaeological sites do not look the way the textbooks say they should. They do not look like the ancestors of modern Native American populations. They look like something else entirely. This is where the story gets complicated in ways that are genuinely difficult to sit with. Not because the evidence is thin, but because it is substantial, and because it points in directions that the mainstream narrative has spent decades trying not to follow. In 1996, a skull was found in the shallows of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. It was immediately clear to the forensic anthropologist who first examined it that this was an ancient skull. Carbon dating later confirmed it was about 9,000 years old. But what made Kennewick man famous? What made him the subject of a nearly decade-long legal battle between scientists and Native American tribes and the Army Corps of Engineers was not his age. It was his morphology. Kennewick man had skull measurements, bone structures, and physical features that did not match the typical profile of populations believed to have crossed from northeastern Asia. His skull was long and narrow, with features that one team of researchers compared to the Innu, people of Japan, while another team compared them to Polynesians. A third analysis noted similarities to certain South Asian populations. What he did not look like, according to the measurements, was a straightforward ancestor of modern Native Americans whose skeletal profiles typically resemble Northeast Asian populations. Kennewick man was not alone. Skulls from sites like Spirit Caveman, also found in Nevada and dated to over 9,000 years old, showed similar anomalies. The collection of ancient American skulls that predate roughly 6,000 years does not form the neat single-origin population the Clovis first model predicted. It forms something messier, something that suggests the Americas may have been reached by more than one population, traveling by more than one route, possibly separated by thousands of years. Some researchers have pointed to a coastal route, a path along the Pacific shoreline, as an alternative to, or supplement to, the Bingia land bridge. This coastal migration theory holds that ancient peoples could have traveled by watercraft along the Kelp Highway. The productive coastal ecosystem that ran from Japan along the North Pacific Rim and down the western coast of North America. This route would explain how populations arrived so quickly in South America. It would explain the anomalous skull morphology in some ancient remains. It would explain the linguistic and genetic data that points to multiple waves of migration, rather than one. And it has one major disadvantage from an archaeological perspective. Most of the coastal sites where evidence of these early travelers might have been found are now underwater. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, they rose more than 100 meters. Every camp, every meaden, every tool scatter along the ancient Pacific shoreline is now sitting beneath the ocean. We are looking for evidence of coastal migration, with most of the evidence already buried under hundreds of feet of water. So what we are left with is a picture of the deep American past that is fragmentary, contested, and stubbornly resistant to simple answers. People were here earlier than we thought. They may have come by more than one route. They may have been more diverse in their physical characteristics than any single migration model can explain. And they left behind over the tens of thousands of years before any European arrived, something far more complex than the popular image of Stone Age hunter-gatherers suggests. They left behind cities, ceremonial centers, road systems, astronomical observatories, and earthworks so massive that they dwarf anything built in the Old World during the same period. Let us talk about the mounds. If you drive through the state of Ohio today, you will pass through ordinary American landscape, gas stations and strip malls and farmland, the particular flatness of the Midwest, broken by the occasional rise of a hill. But some of those hills are not hills. Some of them are deliberate constructions built by human hands, shaped and reshaped over generations, carrying meanings we can only partially recover. The Hopewell tradition, which flourished roughly from 100 BCE to 500 CE, left behind an earthwork complex in the area now known as Newark, Ohio, that is almost impossible to describe without sounding like you are exaggerating. The Newark earthworks at their peak covered more than 4 square miles. They consisted of a great circle, an octagon, a series of parallel walls, and a long pathway running toward a smaller circle, all connected in a geometric design so precise that modern surveyors have found alignments, with lunar cycles that span nearly 19 years. The octagon at Newark is aligned to the northernmost moonrise on the horizon, an event that only occurs at the peak of the lunar standstill cycle, which happens once every 6 years. To plan and execute an earthwork aligned to an astronomical event that occurs less than twice in a human generation requires systematic observation, passed down over multiple generations, and a level of institutional memory and engineering sophistication that we do not typically associate with the cultures of ancient North America. The Newark earthworks are now mostly buried under a city and a golf course. The Great Circle is preserved as a state park. The octagon is partially preserved also as a golf course, an irony so painful that archaeologists have been fighting for decades to have it listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and return to something closer to its original state. Most visitors who see it today do not fully understand what they are looking at. They see a grassy expanse with some earthen banks. What they are actually seeing is one of the most sophisticated astronomical instruments built by any civilization in the ancient world. But the Newark earthworks are only one node in a network. The Hopewell people built across an enormous geographic range from Kansas to New York, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. They traded obsidian from Yellowstone, copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. They built a trade network that spanned the entire continent at a time when, according to the conventional picture, North America was home only to small bands of isolated hunter-gatherers with no significant contact between distant regions. This trade network existed. The goods are in the ground. The obsidian from Yellowstone has been found in Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio. The copper from Lake Superior has been found in mounds in Illinois and Missouri. The shells from the Gulf Coast turn up in excavations 1,000 memas from the sea. This is not conjecture. This is archaeology. Whoever the Hopewell people were, They were not isolated. They were connected to each other, and to the entire continent, in ways we are only beginning to cock. And the copper is worth stopping on for a moment. Lake Superior is the surface manifestation of one of the most remarkable geological features in North America. Beneath its shores lies one of the largest deposits of pure native copper anywhere on the Sound. In copper, not copper ore that needs to be smelted and refined, pure workable raw copper sitting in the rock, sometimes in pieces so large that ancient people could simply pick them up and begin working them. This copper was mined extensively systematically, at a scale that when archaeologists first began to understand its dimensions seemed almost impossible to believe. The old copper complex, as archaeologists now call it, dates back at least 6,000 years, and possibly as far as 10,000 years. Thousands of ancient mine pits have been found along the shores of Lake Superior, many of them on Isle Royale, the island wilderness that now forms a national park. The pits are still there, hundreds of them, some up to 20 feet deep, cut into solid rock with stone hammers. Millions of pounds of copper were extracted from these mines over the course of thousands of years, and then around 3,000 years ago, the mining largely stopped. We do not know why. But here is the thing that makes archaeologists genuinely uncomfortable when they try to account for all this copper. The quantities extracted from the Lake Superior mines are vast. By some estimates, at least 500 million pounds of copper were removed from the region over the millennia of ancient mining, and yet only a small fraction of that copper has been found in North American archaeological sites. The burial mounds, the caches of ancient tools, the trade goods excavated from sites across the continent. They account for some of the copper, but not most of it. Not even close. Where did it go? This question sits at the center of one of the most extraordinary and ignored debates in American archaeology. Some researchers have pointed to the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations of the Old World. Around 1200 BCE is a possible answer. The Bronze Age, which flourished across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and parts of Europe, required enormous quantities of copper. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and while tin was available in parts of Europe, copper was far less abundant. Ancient copper mines in Cyprus and Sardinia and other Mediterranean regions could not account for the quantities needed to support Bronze Age civilization at its peak. And then around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Civilizations collapsed. Trade routes broke down. The Bronze Age ended with a violence and a thoroughness that archaeologists have been trying to spookiness. Some researchers working outside the boundaries of mainstream academia have proposed that the missing copper from Lake Superior ended up in Bronze Age Europe, that ancient sailors, possibly Phoenician or pre-Phoenician, crossed the Atlantic in the centuries before the supposed Age of Discovery, that the copper they brought back fueled the Bronze Age, and that when the mining stopped around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapsed, partly because the copper supply was suddenly cut off. This is a minority view. Most mainstream archaeologists dismiss it without much engagement, and it is true that the evidence for regular transatlantic contact in the Bronze Age is circumstantial and contested. But the copper problem is real. The missing copper is real, and anyone who tells you that question has been satisfactorily answered within the conventional framework is not being fully honest about the state of the evidence. What we know is this: something happened with that copper. A massive extraction operation ran for thousands of years and then stopped. The copper went somewhere, and the destinations of ancient American copper remain in part genuinely unknown. Let us move now from the shores of Lake Superior to the Mississippi River Valley, and from copper to something even more difficult to explain. Let us talk about a city. At its peak around the year 1050 CE, the city known today as Cahokia was home to somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. This makes it at that moment in time one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London, larger than most cities in Europe. Sitting in what is now the floodplain of the Mississippi River, just east of modern-day St. Louis, Cahokia was a major urban center, a political and ceremonial capital, a hub of trade and production and ritual, built by a people whose descendants are still debated, and whose collapse, around 1300 CE, is still not fully understood. The central monument of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, a flat-topped urn pyramid that covers 14 acres at its base and rises to a height of about 100 feet. It is the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico, and it was built entirely by hand. The builders had no metal tools, no draft animals, no wheels. They moved an estimated 22 million cub-feet of earth in baskets carried on human backs layer by layer over multiple centuries. The result is a structure comparable in volume to some of the smaller Egyptian pyramids built in a river valley, thousands of miles from the nearest stone quarry. But Monk's Mound is not just big, it is precisely positioned. The axis of the main pyramid aligns with the cardinal directions. The surrounding complex of smaller mounds and plazas follows a geometric plan that was clearly designed from the beginning as a unified whole. The Grand Plaza at the foot of Monk's Mound covers 40 acres and was deliberately leveled by removing the natural topography and replacing it with a thick layer of engineered fill to create an artificial flat surface. The precision of this construction, documented by archaeologists through systematic excavation and soil analysis, tells a story of centralized planning and technical expertise that complicates the picture of North America before Columbus in fundamental ways. Cahokia also had a wood henge, several of them in fact. At various periods in the city's history, enormous circles of cedar posts were erected in the ground west of Monk's Mound. These post circles, which archaeologists have called woodhenge after the more famous stone circles of Neolithic Europe, were astronomical instruments. They were used to mark the solstices and equinoxes with precision. On the morning of the spring equinox, a person standing at the center of Woodhenge would have seen the sun rise directly over Monk's Mound. This is not coincidence. This is intention. And Cahokia had something else. It had evidence of a ritual event so disturbing, so far outside the expected picture of ancient North American society, that it generated serious controversy when it was first published and has never been fully explained. In a burial pit at Cahokia known as Mound 72, archaeologists found the remains of a young man, apparently a person of high status, laid out on a bed of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around him were the remains of more than 200 other individuals. Most were young women between the ages of 15 and 25, buried in groups, apparently sacrificed. Human sacrifice is documented in many ancient cultures: the Aztec, the Maya, ancient Egypt, the cultures of the ancient Near East. But the mainstream picture of ancient North America, particularly the cultures north of Mexico, has generally been presented as relatively egalitarian, as lacking the kind of rigid social hierarchies that gave rise to large-scale ritual sacrifice in other parts of the world. Mound 72 suggests this picture is incomplete. Cahokia had wealth, it had hierarchy, it had a ruler or a ruling class with authority enough to demand the deaths of hundreds of people for a single burial ceremony. This is not the picture of simple hunter-gatherers. This is something far more complex, far more organized, and far more difficult to fit into the conventional narrative. And then Cahokia vanished. Around 1300 CE, the city was abandoned. The population dispersed. Within a few centuries, the site was so overgrown that European explorers had no idea they were walking past the ruins of a major urban center. French missionaries in the 17th century thought Monk's Mound was a natural hill. It was not until the 19th century that serious archaeological investigation began, and not until the late 20th century that the full scale of what Cahokia had been began to be understood. What caused the collapse? Climate change is the leading theory. A period of drought and flooding during the 13th century would have stressed the agricultural systems that fed the city's population, potentially triggering famine, social unrest, and ultimately abandonment. There is also evidence of wooden walls, defensive palisades built around parts of the city, suggesting internal conflict or external threat in the city's final centuries. The collapse of Cahokia was not quiet. It was in whatever way it unfolded a significant event in the history of the continent. But its legacy did not disappear entirely. The cultural patterns that Cahokia represented, the symbolic system of the falcon, the mound building tradition, the ritual cosmology spread and persisted in modified forms across the American Southeast and Midwest for centuries after the city's fall. The Mississippian culture of which Cahokia was the apex left traces in the beliefs and practices of many Native American peoples whose descendants are still alive today. The world that Cahokia created did not simply end when its buildings fell and its population scattered. It went underground. It persisted in memory and practice and tradition, waiting to be rediscovered. There is a particular quality to American mystery that distinguishes it from mysteries in other parts of the world. In the Old World, in Egypt or Greece or Mesopotamia, the ruins are visible. They rise above the desert. They are photographed and catalogued and painted. They are tourist destinations. The mystery is about interpretation, about what these well-known ruins mean. But in America, many of the most significant ruins are barely visible at all. They are mounds that look like hills. They are earthworks that look like natural ridges. They are features of the landscape so thoroughly reclaimed by the earth that you have to know what you are looking for to find them. And this invisibility has made American archaeology both more exciting and more tragic than the archaeology of any other part of the world. Because every year more is found, and every year what is found is stranger than what came before it. Consider the state of Georgia. If you were to fly over the northern Georgia mountains in a light plane with the right eyes and the right conditions, you might notice something unusual about certain hilltops. Walls, stone walls running along the crests of ridges, encircling summits, connecting peaks in patterns that clearly reflect deliberate human design. These walls are not from the colonial period. They are not from the 19th century. They predate any known European settlement in the region by an unknown but substantial margin. They are called generically the Georgia Mountain Stone Walls, and they have been the subject of decades of low-level scholarly dispute and popular fascination without ever quite breaking into the mainstream of American archaeological attention. Some of these walls run for miles. Some enclose areas of dozens of acres. The construction requires enormous amounts of labor and a degree of planning that suggests a society far more organized than the small bands of foragers that the conventional model posits for the pre-Columbian Southeast. Some researchers have tried to fit these walls into the context of later Mississippian or woodland period cultures. Others have dated them to much earlier periods. The full story of who built these walls, when and why, remains genuinely unsettled, and Georgia is not exceptional in this. The American landscape is full of unexplained stone structures, often dismissed or ignored by the mainstream archaeological establishment, sometimes because they are genuinely ambiguous, and sometimes because their existence would require uncomfortable revisions to accepted history. New England is perhaps the most startling case. The landscape of Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut contains hundreds of stone chambers, stone walls, stone circles, and stone cairns whose origins are disputed. The conventional explanation for most of these features is that they were built by European farmers in the colonial and post-colonial period, using fieldstones cleared from agricultural land and techniques brought from Europe. This explanation is often correct for the walls themselves, but the chambers are different. The stone chambers of New England are remarkable structures. They are partially underground, built into hillsides, or constructed from large, upright stones and covered with enormous flat capstones. Their interiors are narrow and low-ceiling oriented, so that sunlight enters only during specific astronomical events. Some of them are aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, flooding the interior with light only on the shortest day of the year. Others are aligned to the equinoxes. The quality of construction in some of these chambers, the precision with which the stones are fitted, the deliberateness of their astronomical orientations suggests something more intentional than colonial-era root cellars. The mainstream view holds that these are colonial root cellars, storage structures built by European farmers to preserve food through the winter, and some of them undoubtedly are. But others resist this explanation. The alignments are too precise. The locations, often on hilltops or ridgeal lines rather than near farmhouses and barns, are Retskin's storage purposes, and the construction techniques in some cases predate the colonial period based on lichen growth studies and soil analysis. Who built them? No one is sure. Native American traditions in New England do not for the most part claim these structures. They were there when the Europeans arrived. They were there in the understanding of many indigenous peoples since before living memory. Some researchers have connected them to the Algonquin practice of placing stones in ceremonial ways to mark significant places in the landscape. Others have pointed to pre-Columbian contacts with Celtic or Phoenician or Norse peoples, suggesting that some of these structures reflect architectural traditions from across the Atlantic. Most mainstream archaeologists find this last suggestion unlikely, but the structures themselves, whatever their origin, are real, and their alignments are real, and someone built them. The question of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas is perhaps the most radioactive topic in all of American archaeology. It touches questions of national identity, of indigenous history, of scientific credibility, and of cultural ownership in ways that make almost everyone involved feel defensive and compromised. And yet the evidence for at least some form of contact before Columbus is, if you approach it with honest eyes, genuinely substantial. Let us begin with what is undisputed. The Norse reached North America around 1000 CE. Lance O. Meadows in Newfoundland is an excavated North site, definitively dated and definitively identified. The first confirmed European presence in the Americas before Columbus. The Vinland sagas describe voyages to a land west of Greenland that offered grapes and timber and hostile indigenous people. The location of Vinland, the extent of Norse exploration beyond Newfoundland, the nature of Norse interaction with the inhabitants of the continent, all of these remain debated, but the fact of Norse arrival is settled. Columbus did not discover America. The Norse were there 500 years before him, but the Norse may not have been the first. In 2021, a team of archaeologists using dendrochronology, the science of dating structures by analyzing tree rings, pinpointed the year 2021 CE as the year when North settlers at Lonsor Meadows were cutting trees. This makes the Norse presence in North America precisely datable and precisely real. It also raises the question of what the Norse found when they arrived. The indigenous people they encountered in the Vinland sagas, called Skraelings, were already there. They had their own boats, and their own weapons, and their own networks. They were not isolated. They were connected to a vast web of human activity across the continent. But before the Norse, before their precise 1021 CE contact, there is the question of earlier visitors, the Phoenicians, the ancient Egyptians, the Chinese, the Romans. All of these have been proposed as candidates for pre-Columbian contact with the Americas, and all of these proposals have been met with varying degrees of serious archaeological analysis and establishment resistance. The most famous evidence, and in many ways, the most intriguing, is the presence in Mesoamerica and South America of plant species that could not have arrived there without human transport. The sweet potatoes is native to the Americas, yet it was being cultivated in Paullinia at least 1,000 years before Columbus. The only explanation that accounts for this fact is that someone brought it there. Someone made a voyage from South America to Paullinia, or from Polynesia to South America, and carried sweet potato tubers across thousands of miles of open ocean. The genetic analysis of Polynesian sweet potato populations confirms this. They are descended from South American varieties. Contact happened before Columbus across the Pacific. And then there is the chicken. The domestic chicken originated in Southeast Asia and was introduced to South America before European contact based on chicken bones found at pre-Columbian sites in Chile, with carbon dates that predate any possible European introduction. The genetics of these pre-Columbian South American chickens matches Polynesian populations rather than European ones, which means the birds arrived via a Pacific route rather than an Atlantic one. This is another confirmed case of pre-Columbian contact across the Pacific Ocean. If Polynesian voyagers were making contact with South America, the question becomes not whether such contact occurred, but how extensive and how systematic it was, and whether the cultural exchange that accompanied it was significant enough to leave traces in art, architecture, religion, or technology. Some researchers believe it was. The presence in Mesoamerican art of what appear to be elephant-like creatures, of what appear to be representations of bearded men, of architectural motifs that have parallels in the ancient Near East or in Egypt, has fueled arguments for much older and more sustained contact across the Atlantic. These arguments are almost universally dismissed by mainstream archaeologists who point out that apparent similarities in art and architecture can almost always be explained by parallel development, by the universal tendencies of human visual imagination, and by the common structural constraints of building with stone. Two cultures independently developing a four-sided pyramid with a flat top does not require contact. It requires basic geometry. This is a fair point. It is also on its own not a complete answer, because some of the specific coincidences between Old World and New World cultures are difficult to explain away with parallel development alone. Consider the tobacco pipe. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Caribbean and Central America in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they encountered a practice they had never seen before: the smoking of tobacco through pipes. Tobacco was a New World plant unknown in the Old World before Columbus. Yet in 1992, a German toxicologist named Fetla Balabanova published a study that sent shock waves through the archaeological community. Balabanova and her colleagues had tested mummies from ancient Egypt, some dating back 3,000 years, and found chemical signatures of tobacco and cocaine in the mummy tissues. Tobacco and cocaine are both New World substances. Neither should exist in ancient Egyptian mummies if there was no pre-Columbian contact. The study was attacked immediately. Critics suggested contamination, methodological errors, various alternative explanations. Balabanova repeated and refined the analysis. The results held. Other researchers tested other mummies and found similar results. The tobacco signature is particularly difficult to explain away as contamination because it shows up in internal organ tissue in a pattern consistent with habitual use over a lifetime, not surface contamination. What does this mean? It means either that the standard model of pre-Columbian isolation between the Old World and the New World is wrong in ways we have not yet fully reckoned with, or that there is some other explanation for the presence of New World plant derivatives in ancient Egyptian mummies that no one has yet identified. This is not a minor footnote. If Egyptian mummies contain tobacco and cocaine residue, someone was moving goods between Egypt and the Americas more than 3,000 years ago. That would rewrite history. The mainstream response has been to ignore this evidence rather than to refute it. Definitively, it does not appear in standard textbooks. It is not the subject of major follow-up research funded by leading institutions. It sits in the literature documented and unrebuted, waiting for someone to take it seriously enough to either confirm or conclusively disprove it. This is a pattern you encounter over and over again when you start digging into American prehistory. Evidence that does not fit. Evidence that is documented and real and scientifically measured. Evidence that is then quietly sidelined. Not because it has been disproven, but because it is too inconvenient, because it asks too much of the existing model, because the implications are too large and too disruptive to absorb, without a fundamental rethinking of everything we thought we knew. There is a valley in the American Southwest where the silence has a weight to it that you can feel before you understand it. The canyon walls rise hundreds of feet on either side, pale and striated in the afternoon light, and the sky above is so blue it looks painted. This is Chico Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico, and it was 1,000 years ago the center of the largest civilization north of Mexico. A civilization that built structures so precisely aligned with the heavens that they continue to astonish engineers and astronomers who study them today. Chico Canyon was occupied and developed by the people archaeologists call the ancestral Puebloans, also known as the Anazi, a Navajo word whose precise translation is disputed, but is sometimes rendered as Ancient Ones. They were not mystery people. They were not aliens. They were human beings who developed over several centuries a remarkably sophisticated culture in one of the most challenging environments on the continent. An environment where rain is scarce, temperatures are extreme, and the margin between survival and starvation is thin enough that you can see it from both sides at once. What they built in Cho Canyon, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, is staggering. The Great Houses, as archaeologists call them, are not houses in any domestic sense. They are massive, multi-storied apartment-like structures, built from precisely shaped sandstone blocks and wooden beams, dragged from forests dozens of miles away. Pueblo Bonito, the largest great house at Chaco, had more than 600 rooms and rose to 5 stories in places. It was not significantly surpassed as the largest building in North America until the late 19th century, when modern construction techniques finally exceeded what the ancestral Puebloans achieved with human hands and stone tools 1,000 years earlier. The precision of Chacoan construction is one of its most discussed features, but it is the precision of the planning, not just the building, that demands the most careful attention. Chaco Canyon sits at the center of a road network that extends for hundreds of miles in multiple directions. These roads, called the Chacoan road system, were discovered when aerial photography of the region began to reveal long, straight lines crossing the desert, lines that clearly reflect human engineering rather than natural geology. The roads are wide, often 30 feet across, and they run in perfectly straight lines, regardless of the terrain. They do not curve around obstacles, they cut through them, or they climb over them via carved stairways, cut directly into the canyon walls. Where do the roads go? Some of them lead to outlier communities, to other great houses built on the Chacoan model, but located far from the canyon itself. The road system connects Chaco to a network of related sites spread across an enormous territory. The spacing between these outlier communities is remarkably consistent, suggesting that the entire network was planned from the beginning with a coherent spatial logic. Some researchers have described the Chacoan road system as a kind of sacred geography, a physical inscription of a cosmological worldview onto the landscape itself. Others see in it an economic and political infrastructure, a system for moving goods and people and power across a large territory. Both interpretations are probably partially correct. The roads also in many cases extend beyond any identified destination. They go out into the desert and then simply stop, or they continue to places where there is no evidence of any community. These sections of road, without a visible destination, have puzzled archaeologists for decades. Some researchers have proposed that the roads had a ritual function, that the act of walking them was itself significant, that they were pathways for ceremony as much as for transport. Others have suggested that the roads may extend to sites not yet discovered, that the desert has not given up all its secrets. What it has given up in the form of astronomical alignments is extraordinary. The great houses at Chaco are aligned to the cardinal directions and to the solar and lunar cycles with a precision that required both careful observation and sophisticated planning. The southeast corner of Pueblo Bonito is aligned to the winter solstice sunrise. The main axis of several of the great houses tracks the summer solstice. A spiral petroglyph, carved into a rock face on Fajardo, but a prominent Mia within the canyon, serves as a solar calendar. At the solstices and equinoxes, daggers of light, created by rock slabs, positioned in front of the spiral pass through the design in specific and obviously intentional ways. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Chaco is not accidental. It is not the product of chance alignment. It is the result of systematic observation passed down through generations, encoded in stone, and expressed in a built environment designed to harmonize with the movements of celestial bodies. The people who built Chaco understood their position in the cosmos in a precise and technical way. They knew when things would happen in the sky before they happened, and they arranged their world to mark those moments. This is not primitive. This is sophisticated. This is the product of a civilization with deep roots in observation, memory, and the application of knowledge across generations. And yet, Checo too was abandoned. Around 1150 CE, the canyon was largely depopulated. The great houses were left empty. The roads fell quiet. The extraordinary civilization that had created one of the most remarkable architectural achievements in the ancient world simply dissolved, dispersed, moved on. The descendants of the Chowan people are widely believed to be the modern Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest. The Hopi, the Zuri, the people of Acoma, and other communities who carry within their traditions and their architecture and their cosmological understanding the inheritance of what Chico was. They did not vanish, they transformed. But what they left behind in that canyon, the massive silent stones, the empty rooms, the perfectly aligned walls, belongs to a world that no longer exists in any form we can directly touch. Why did they leave? The standard answer is drought. The 12th century was a period of sustained aridity in the American Southwest, a fact documented in tree ring records that provide a remarkably precise picture of year-by-year rainfall over the past 2,000 years. The droughts that struck the Chowan system were severe and sustained, and the agricultural systems that fed the great houses would have been stretched to breaking point under such conditions. Environmental stress is almost certainly part of the story, but drought alone does not explain everything. There is evidence at some Chacoan sites of violence, of burned structures, of hasty abandonment. There is evidence that the social system that held the Chacoan world together was itself under strain, that the hierarchy that had organized the labor and the trade and the ritual was experiencing challenges that no rain could have caused. The collapse of Chaco, like the collapse of Cahokia, was likely a convergence of factors, environmental and social, building on each other until the whole system became unmanageable. The specific weight of each factor, the precise sequence of events, remains an active area of research and debate. What we know is that they left, and what they left tells us more about who they were than any written text could. Move east from Choco, across the Great Plains, and eventually you reach another set of mysteries. The effigy mounds of the Midwest, the great animal-shaped earthworks built by peoples who lived along the Mississippi River and its tributaries in the centuries before and after the Common Era. Ohio's Serpent Mound is perhaps the most famous, a quarter-mile-long earthwork in the shape of a serpent, its body coiling across a ridge in Adams County, its open mouth aimed at the summer solstice sunset. The serpent is believed to represent a cosmic or spiritual entity of enormous significance in the belief system of its builders. The head of the serpent aligns with the summer solstice sunset. The coils of the body track other celestial events. The entire structure is both a work of art and an astronomical instrument embedded in the landscape. Who built Serpent Mound? This is contested. The earliest excavations attributed it to the Adena culture, which flourished in the Ohio Valley from roughly 1000 BCE to 100 CE. More recent research has suggested the Hopewell or Fort ancient cultures dating to later periods. Still, other analysis points to multiple phases of construction, suggesting that the mound was built, modified, and rebuilt by successive cultures over a long period. Whatever its exact origins, Serpent Mound has been a significant feature of the Ohio landscape for at least 1,500 years, and possibly much longer. The effigy mound tradition reaches its most spectacular expression in Wisconsin, where hundreds of earthen animals, birds, bears, and human figures dot the landscape of the southern part of the state. These effigy mounds are smaller than the great works of the Hopewell or Mississippian traditions, more intimate in scale, but no less remarkable in their conception. They represent a cosmological vision of the world as populated by animal spirits, a view of the landscape as a living spiritual entity rather than merely a physical environment. The mounds were not primarily burial sites, although some do contain burials. They were, it appears, markers of territory and cosmology. a way of inscribing meaning onto the landscape. The people who built the Wisconsin effigy mounds are believed to be ancestral to the historic Siouan and Algonquian peoples of the region, though the specific connections remain debated. What is clear is that the tradition of building animal-shaped mounds, of using the earth itself as a medium for spiritual expression, was widespread across much of North America during the millennium before European contact, and that it produced works of extraordinary scale and sophistication. One of the most persistent and most uncomfortable questions in American archaeology involves the human skull. Not figuratively, literally. The measurement and morphological analysis of ancient American skulls has been for most of the 20th century a politically charged and scientifically fraught enterprise. One where the desire for a clean, unified story about human origins has sometimes conflicted with what the bones themselves seem to be saying. We have already discussed Kennewick Man and the complications his skull measurements introduced into the standard Clover First model, but Kennewick Man is not the only anomalous ancient American skull. He is part of a pattern that extends across the continent and backward through time in ways that have not been satisfactorily resolved. In the Lagoa Santa region of Brazil, a collection of ancient human skulls, dating back more than 10,000 years, has been studied by physical anthropologists since the 19th century. The Lagoa Santa skulls, like Kennewick Man, show a morphological pattern that does not match the typical profile of populations with recent Northeast Asian ancestry. They are long and narrow, with features that some researchers have compared to Australian Aboriginal populations or to some African groups. This has led to the hypothesis, controversial but not dismissed, that the Americas may have been reached by multiple populations following different routes, and that the earliest inhabitants may have been partially or largely replaced by later, arriving groups carrying the genetic profile more typical of modern Native Americans. This hypothesis, sometimes called the Paleo-American hypothesis, remains genuinely debated. Recent ancient DNA analysis has complicated it. The DNA extracted from the Lagoa Santa individuals shows a genetic signature closer to modern Native Americans than to Australian Aborigines, which has led some researchers to conclude that the morphological similarities are misleading. That skull shape is not as reliable a guide to genetic ancestry as once believed. Others argue that the DNA analysis is not complete enough to close the question, that the earliest American populations may have carried genetic material that was largely but not entirely replaced by later migrations, and that the skull morphology reflects something real about this complex history. The honest answer is that we do not know. The question of who the first Americans were, in terms of both genetic ancestry and physical morphology, is genuinely open. The answers coming from ancient DNA studies are becoming more detailed every year as the technology improves and as more ancient samples are analyzed. But the picture that is emerging is not simpler than what came before. It is more complex. Multiple waves of migration, multiple genetic populations contributing to the modern Native American gene pool. The Americas in their prehistory were not a blank canvas awaiting a single founding population. They were the destination of repeated complex migrations across thousands of years, and woven through all of this, connecting the mounds and the skulls and the copper and the stone chambers, is the question of oral tradition. Indigenous peoples across North America have maintained oral traditions about their history that stretch back far further than the few centuries before European contact that conventional archaeology typically focuses on. These traditions speak of migrations and catastrophes and ancestors who came from great distances. They speak of advanced civilizations that rose and fell before the present order of things. They speak sometimes of peoples who were there before the current inhabitants, people who built things and knew things and then were gone. The dismissal of oral tradition as a reliable historical source is one of the most significant intellectual failures of Western scholarship in the Americas. The assumption that memory without writing is unreliable memory has been repeatedly challenged by cases where indigenous oral traditions turned out to preserve accurate information about events thousands of years in the past. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians, for example, have been shown in multiple cases to preserve accurate memories of sea level changes and geological events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. There is no obvious reason why Native American oral traditions should be less accurate than Australian ones, and considerable reason to think that some of them preserve genuine, historical information about the deep past of the continent. One of the most striking examples involves the Osage people and their traditions about ancient earthworks in the Ozark region of Missouri and Arkansas. Osage oral tradition describes a time when the Osage lived in a land with great mounds and ceremonial centers, and speaks of older peoples who occupied the region before them. When archaeologists began systematically investigating the Ozarks in the 20th century, they found evidence of exactly this. Ancient ceremonial sites, stone structures, and earthworks predating any known historic Native American culture in the region. The Osage tradition was not metaphor or legend, it was a memory of something real. Similar examples could be multiplied across the continent. The point is not that every oral tradition should be taken as literal historical fact. The point is that dismissing oral tradition wholesale, as Western scholarship too often has, cost us information that cannot be recovered any other way. The people who lived on this continent for tens of thousands of years before Europeans arrived knew things about their own history. They remembered things. They encoded memory in narrative and in ceremony and in the names of places. And a great deal of that knowledge has been lost, not because it was forgotten, but because the conditions created by colonization made its transmission impossible. The destruction of indigenous cultures, languages, and institutions that accompanied European settlement of the Americas was comprehensive enough and deliberate enough, in many cases, that the question of what knowledge was permanently lost is itself one of the great, unanswerable questions of American history. We know that elaborate astronomical knowledge was encoded in Mayan manuscripts, most of which were destroyed by Spanish priests. We know that the Inca maintained records in a complex system of knotted strings called quipu, the full decipherment of which still eludes modern scholars. We know that complex systems of knowledge about the natural world, about plants and animals and weather and the sky, were maintained in cultures across the Americas and transmitted primarily through oral means that became impossible to sustain when communities were destroyed. What we do not know, and cannot know, is how much of the information that might have helped us understand American prehistory died with the people who held it. How much of the mystery of ancient America is mystery because the answers were in traditions that were severed before anyone thought to record them. How many questions that we approach with expensive technology and complicated scientific methods could have been answered by an elder in a village that no longer exists. This is not simply a matter of historical sadness, it is a methodological problem. The destruction of indigenous knowledge is an epistemological catastrophe. It means that the scientific investigation of American prehistory is proceeding with one hand tied behind its back, looking for answers in the ground, and in the sky, and in the genes. When some of the answers may have once existed in the minds and mouths of human beings who were prevented from passing them on, the stones at least survive. Let us look more closely at some of them. In the state of Minnesota, there is a runstone, or there is a rock with marks on it, depending on whom you ask. In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olaf Oman claimed to have dug it up entangled in the roots of a popular tree on his farm near the town of Kensington. The stone bears an inscription in runic characters, the alphabet used by medieval Scandinavians, that describes an expedition of Norsemen who traveled through the region in 1362. The inscription speaks of killings and of finding 10 men red with blood and dead, and of an encampment at a sea some time away. The Kensington runstone has been called a hoax since almost the moment it was discovered. Academic runic scholars who examined early photographs of the inscription pronounced it a modern forgery, pointing to aspects of the language and the letter forms that they said were inconsistent with genuine medieval Norse usage. The stone was rejected by the Smithsonian and by the archaeological establishment, and for most of the 20th century, it sat in relative obscurity, displayed in a local museum, widely regarded as an embarrassment rather than an artifact. Then, beginning in the 1990s and continuing through the 2000s, a series of researchers began looking at the stone with fresh eyes and new tools. Geological analysis of the weathering patterns on the stone suggested that the inscription was significantly older than the 1890s, that the runes had been carved before Oman could have made them. Linguistic analysis by some researchers found that the language of the inscription, while unusual, was not impossible for a 14th-century Norse speaker. Studies of the specific dialect and grammatical forms used in the inscription suggested a connection to 14th-century Gotlandic Swedish rather than to any modern Scandinavian language, which argues against a 19th-century forgery by a Swedish immigrant. The debate about the Kensington runestone continues. It has not been definitively proven genuine, and it has not been definitively proven a hoax. It sits in that uncomfortable space where the evidence is ambiguous enough that reasonable scholars can disagree, where the implications of authenticity are large enough that many prefer the comfort of dismissal. If the Kensington runestone is genuine, it documents Norse exploration of the North American interior 2 centuries before Columbus, a voyage that would require a journey from Hudson Bay or another northern coastal point deep into what is now the American Midwest. It would require the Norse to have known about the continent's interior river systems, to have navigated them, and to have penetrated to a point not reached by recorded European exploration until the 18th century. That is a large implication, large enough that the default position of the academic establishment has been, and continues to be, skepticism so strong it is functionally indistinguishable from close-mindedness. Perhaps the stone is a hoax. Perhaps it is genuine. What is certain is that the question has not been answered honestly and completely, and that the answering of it has been impeded by the very strength of the cultural investment in the conventional narrative. The Norse presence in North America is confirmed. The extent of that presence is not. The evidence suggests it was larger than the single site at Lonsor Meadows, but the full picture remains to be drawn. It is possible, and some researchers believe likely, that Norse voyagers explored significant portions of the eastern seaboard and the interior river systems of North America before the river trail of their presence goes cold in the historical and archaeological record. What they encountered, what they traded, what they brought back, and what they left behind in much of the physical traces and in cultural influence are questions that remain open. These are not trivial questions. Every time we find evidence of a contact we did not know about, every time a date gets pushed back, or a morphological analysis produces an unexpected result, or a genetic study reveals a migration we did not predict, the story of America becomes larger and stranger and more complex. And the story we were told, the reassuring story of discovery and settlement and progress, shrinks a little, becomes a little less like history and a little more like myth. There are walls in Peru that no engineer has satisfactorily explained. The site of Sacsayhuaman, above the city of Cusco, contains stones so large, fitted together so precisely, that even with modern cranes and laser-guided tools, it would be extraordinarily difficult to replicate the construction. Single stones at Sacsayhuaman weigh more than 100 tons. They fit together without mortar, without any gap between them, in joints so tight that not even a sheet of paper can be slipped between the surfaces. They were not smoothed by machine. They were shaped by human hands with stone and bronze tools, fitted by trial and adjustment, seated with a precision that modern masons describe as almost impossible to achieve with any tools at all. Sacswoman is in South America, not North America, but the mystery it represents extends across the hemisphere. The civilizations of the Americas, not just the Maya and the Inca and the Aztec, but the civilizations of North America as well, achieved levels of engineering, astronomical knowledge, and social organization that our standard models of pre-Columbian development do not adequately account for. We speak of these cultures as hunter-gatherers, who developed agriculture, and then over a few thousand years, produced complex societies. But the complexity of what they produced, the precision of their constructions, the sophistication of their astronomical knowledge, suggests a trajectory of development that was longer, deeper, and more connected than we have generally assumed. Let us look at astronomy. The Maya are famous for their calendar systems, their knowledge of celestial mechanics, their ability to predict eclipses centuries in advance. Less well known is the astronomical sophistication of North American cultures. We have already discussed the alignments at Cahokia, Chaco, and Newark, but the evidence extends much further. In Wyoming, there is a medicine wheel on the summit of Medicine Mountain in the Bighorn Range. This stone circle made from cans connected by stone lines radiating from a central hub sits at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, in a location accessible only during the brief summer months. The medicine wheel is aligned in ways that mark the summer solstice sunrise and sunset, and the on-rising points of several bright stars that appeared on the horizon just before the summer solstice. The alignments were identified by the astronomer John Eddy in the 1970s, and they are real alignments, not the result of chance or wishful pattern recognition. The wheel was designed, at least in part, as an astronomical instrument. Radiocarbon dating and other analyses suggest the Bighorn medicine wheel is at least several hundred years old, with some evidence pointing to origins more than 1,000 years in the past. Who built it? The answer is uncertain. Several plains cultures have traditions associated with medicine wheels, and oral traditions of some tribes suggest they predate any living memory. Some accounts describe the medicine wheels as made by people who are gone, by ancestors so ancient that their specific identity has been lost, leaving only the stones and a sense of their significance. There are medicine wheels across the northern plains, more than 70 identified stone circles, with varying degrees of alignment and archaeological documentation. They form a pattern, a tradition that crosses many cultural and linguistic boundaries and suggests a shared body of astronomical knowledge transmitted across cultures over a very long period. This kind of cross-cultural transmission of precise astronomical knowledge does not happen spontaneously. It happens through sustained contact, through shared ceremonial practices, through the maintenance of traditions across generations, and across the distances between communities. It implies a level of connectivity and communication across the pre-Columbian North American world that the standard picture of isolated regional cultures does not adequately capture. Now, let us go underground. There are caves in America that have not been fully explored. Some of them have not been entered in living memory. The cave systems of the American Southeast, the Ozarks, the Appalachian, extend for miles beneath the surface, and they have been used by human beings for thousands of years. Some of the oldest art in North America is in caves. Pictographs painted on cave walls in Tennessee and Missouri and Arkansas date back thousands of years and depict complex symbolic imagery that archaeologists are still working to understand. Handprints, animals, geometric designs, human figures in unusual poses, sometimes apparently engaged in ceremonial activity. But there are also caves that contain something more literally remarkable. In the 1930s and 1940s, during the building of the New Deal infrastructure projects and the exploration of previously remote areas, made accessible by new roads and survey technology, a series of discoveries were made in caves and rock shelters across the American West and Southeast that generated enormous controversy and have never been fully resolved. In the caves of the Mammoth Cave region of Kentucky, in the cave systems of the Ozarks, in rock shelters in California and Nevada, researchers reported finding artifacts, human remains, and physical evidence that did not fit comfortably within the accepted archaeological framework. Some of the most striking of these reported discoveries involved apparent giants, human bones of unusual size, skulls with extraordinary cranial volume, remains that, if the measurements reported at the time were accurate, represented individuals substantially larger than the typical range of human variation. These reports were collected and catalogued by researchers like Vine Deloria Jr., the Standing Rock Zoo scholar and activist, and by investigators like Richard Duhurst in his book The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America. And they draw on newspaper accounts and Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries that describe dozens of apparent giant skeletal remains found in burial mounds and caves across the newspaper accounts continent. The official position of the Smithsonian and the American archaeological establishment on these reports is that they were exaggerated, misidentified, or simply false, that the newspaper accounts of the 19th century, which described many of these discoveries, were unreliable, that the giant skeletons were the product of wishful thinking, frontier enthusiasm for the sensational, and the tendency of 19th century reporters to embellish measurements and details to sell papers. This is probably the correct explanation for many, and possibly most of these reports. The 19th century press was indeed unreliable, and the desire for the sensational was indeed strong, but the sheer number of reports drawn from sources as diverse as Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology reports and local newspaper accounts from dozens of different states has led some researchers to wonder whether there is a real signal buried in the noise, whether some small fraction of these reports reflect actual discoveries of skeletal remains with unusual characteristics that were then lost, destroyed, or simply never followed up with scientific rigor. There is also the matter of the institutional record. Some researchers claimed that the Smithsonian Institution received large numbers of anomalous skeletal remains from mound excavations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that many of these remains were subsequently lost or destroyed. This claim has never been definitively proven, but it has also never been definitively disproven. The records of what the Smithsonian received from mound excavations in this period are not complete, and the fate of all the materials collected is not entirely documented. The institution has acknowledged losing or misplacing specimens, which is hardly surprising, given the scale of its collection and the century of time involved. Whether anything significant was among the lost materials is genuinely unknown. I am not telling you to believe in ancient giants. I am telling you that the honest answer to the question of whether any unusual skeletal remains were found in American mounds and caves in the 19th century is not a confident no. The honest answer is that the evidence is incomplete, and the question has not been rigorously revisited with modern methods in any systematic way. The dismissal of the giant reports has been almost entirely based on the assumption that they must be false rather than on a systematic investigation of the historical record. And that assumption-based dismissal is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that the academic establishment has a strong prior towards certain answers and a strong resistance to investigating alternatives, even when the alternatives are not inherently impossible. Humans exhibit significant variation in size. The population that built Cahokia and the Great Mounds included individuals at the tall end of the normal human range. Some skeletal remains from mound excavations may have been individuals who were simply large, by normal standards, and whose measurements were amplified in the reporting. This is the most likely explanation, but it does not require the complete dismissal of all the reports, and it does not preclude the possibility that some of the anomalies documented in 19th century sources represent something worth investigating with 21st century methods. The tragedy of American archaeology is that so much was destroyed or lost before modern methods existed to study it. Mounds were plowed under by farmers who had no idea what they were obliterating. Artifacts were scattered and sold to private collectors and lost to science forever. Sites were built over by cities and highways and shopping centers. The archaeological record of ancient North America is riddled with holes, and those holes are not random. They are the direct result of a culture that for most of its history did not recognize the value of what lay beneath its feet. In the last half-century, things have improved. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 created new, protections for indigenous burial sites, and new requirements for consultation with tribal communities about the disposition of human creations remains. LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses to map the ground surface beneath forest cover and reveal features invisible from ground level, has revolutionized the discovery and mapping of archaeological sites across the Americas. New dating techniques, new genetic analysis methods, new approaches to the chemical analysis of ancient materials, all of these are producing a flood of new information about ancient America. And that information, year by year, is making the story more complex, not less, more varied, not simpler, more ancient, not more recent. Every major revision of the timeline for human presence in the Americas in recent years has pushed the date back, not forward. Every major discovery of a previously unknown ancient site has revealed greater complexity, greater sophistication, greater scale than what was expected. The direction of travel in American archaeology is unmistakably toward a deeper, stranger, more extraordinary past than the conventional model prepared us for. The Amazon River basin covers an area larger than the contiguous United States, and for most of the 20th century, it was assumed to be one of the least hospitable environments for complex civilization on the planet. The forest is dense, the soil is poor, and the conditions for intensive agriculture seemed fundamentally unfavorable for the development of large settled populations. The conventional wisdom held that the Amazon was sparsely populated before European contact, home to small bands of hunter-gatherers and simple horticulturalists, and that the great diversity of indigenous cultures found there by early European explorers represented a primitive baseline, not the remnant of something more complex. That conventional wisdom was wrong, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating dramatically through the use of LiDAR technology and systematic excavation in the 2000s and 2010s. Researchers began to find evidence of something entirely unexpected beneath the Amazon forest. Cities, not cities in the modern sense, not concrete and steel, but cleared and managed landscapes of enormous extent, connected by roads, organized around geometric ceremonial centers, and home to populations numbering in the tens of thousands. The Amazon, it turns out, was not a wilderness when Europeans arrived. It was a garden, a managed, cultivated, deliberately constructed landscape that had been shaped by human hands over centuries. The discovery of what is now called Amazonian dark earth, or terrapa, was an early clue. Terrapa is a type of soil found across significant portions of the Amazon basin that is extraordinarily rich in charcoal, organic matter, and human-made amendments, radically more fertile than the typical nutrient-poor Amazonian soil. It is the product of deliberate soil modification of human beings, systematically adding material to the earth to create a permanent self-renewing agricultural medium. Terrapa does not occur naturally. It was made by millions of people over centuries who understood the chemistry of soil improvement in ways that modern agriculture is only beginning to rediscover. In 2022, a paper published in the journal Science used LiDAR data to document the most extensive network of pre-Columbian sites yet found in the Amazon. In the Llanos demo in Bolivia, researchers mapped more than 200 ancient towns and villages connected by an intricate system of raised causeways, canals, ponds, and geometric earthworks covering tens of thousands of square kilometers. The largest of these ancient towns had populations estimated in the tens of thousands. They were linked by roads that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The entire system had been constructed with engineering precision that required centralized planning and sustained organized labor over many generations. And this was under a forest that had been growing on this landscape for 500 years since the demographic collapse of the indigenous population following European contact. The forest that modern ecologists studied as pristine wilderness was growing on the ruins of a civilization. When European explorers traveled the Amazon in the 16th century, they described cities along the river, large settlements with extensive agriculture and substantial populations. These accounts were dismissed for centuries as exaggeration, as the boasting of adventurers, as the confused reports of people who did not know what they were seeing. Now, the archaeology is showing that the explorers were reporting accurately. There were cities, there was extensive agriculture, there were large populations organized into complex societies, and within a century or two of European contact, disease and violence and enslavement reduced those populations by an estimated 90%. The forest grew back over the ruins, and by the time serious scientific investigation of the Amazon began, the assumption of pristine wilderness had already hardened into received wisdom. The scope of what was lost in the Amazon is staggering. Millions of people, languages we will never know, agricultural techniques developed over centuries, knowledge of medicinal plants, and ecological management that had no written form and that died with the communities that held it. The Amazon is perhaps the most dramatic case, but it is not unique. Similar stories played out across the Americas in the century after European contact. Civilizations that were thriving in 1491 were essentially gone by 1600, destroyed not by conquest alone, but by the invisible weapons of disease, pathogens to which the indigenous populations of the Americas had no previous exposure and no acquired immunity. The scale of indigenous population collapse after European contact is one of the most consequential demographic events in human history, and it is still not fully reckoned with in the popular understanding of American history. The estimates of pre-Columbian population in the Americas have ranged widely from a few million to more than 100 million, and the debate about these numbers is itself a politically charged one. Higher estimates suggest a more populous, more developed, more complex pre-Columbian world, which implies a more catastrophic colonial destruction. Lower estimates suggest a sparer, simpler world, which implies a less devastating impact. The truth appears to be closer to the higher end of the range. One estimate developed by the historian Charles Mann in his influential book 1491 suggests that the Americas may have been home to something like 90 million people at the time of Columbus, making it one of the most densely populated parts of the world. If that figure is even partially correct, the populations and civilizations that sustained those numbers must have been far more complex and far more sophisticated than the textbook picture of simple pre-Columbian cultures allows. You do not feed 90 million people with simple horticulture and hunting. You do not sustain populations of that size without intensive agriculture, without organized distribution systems, without cities and trade networks and political structures, capable of coordinating production and movement of food across large distances. The Americas that Columbus arrived in were not empty. They were full. They were full of people, and full of history, and full of the products of thousands of years of human ingenuity applied to every environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, to high desert plateau. The emptiness came after the wilderness that European settlers moved into in the 17th and 18th centuries was not a natural state. It was the product of catastrophe. The forests of New England that the Pilgrims walked through were growing up through the abandoned fields and orchards of populations that had died of disease decades before the tone. Europeans arrived. The apparent wildness of the American landscape was largely an illusion, created by the speed and totality of indigenous population collapse. This is not ancient history, it is history, and it matters for how we understand ancient America, because the catastrophe of the post-Columbian period destroyed so much of the record of what came before it. We are trying to understand 500 centuries of human history on this continent from a record that was selectively and systematically destroyed in a period of less than 1 century. The gaps are not evenly distributed. They are concentrated in exactly the areas where the evidence would be most significant. Let us now consider something that looks on the surface like a detail, but is actually one of the more extraordinary puzzles in American archaeology: the presence of ancient DNA. Genetic studies of ancient American populations have produced a series of surprises that are reshaping our understanding of how the Americas were settled and by whom. One of the most remarkable findings involves a genetic signature found in certain indigenous groups of the Amazon basin and in the ancient individuals from Lagoa Santa that we discussed. earlier. This genetic signature, sometimes called Population Y after its discoverers, appears to be related to Australian Aboriginal and Pacific populations, rather than to the Northeast Asian populations that the Bingjian migration model predicts. Population Y, or the Australo-Melanesian signature, as it is sometimes called, appears in the genetic record of ancient Amazonian individuals, but has been substantially diluted or absent in modern Amazonian populations, suggesting that the population that carried it was largely replaced by later arrivals. But it was there, a population related to people from the far side of the Pacific, present in the Amazon basin more than 10,000 years ago. How did they get there? The most widely accepted explanation is that they arrived via Bingia, along with the initial, founding population carrying genetic diversity that reflected an East Asian or Pacific Islander ancestral population. A separate migration entirely is considered less likely, but has not been ruled out. Some researchers have proposed an early Pacific crossing, separate from, and possibly, preceding the Bingjian migration, as the mechanism by which Oralo-Melanesian-related genetics entered the Americas. Either way, the genetic evidence is clear that the founding populations of the Americas were more diverse than any simple single migration model predicts, and that some of that early diversity has been partially or largely erased by subsequent population movement and replacement. The Americas were settled by real, complex, messy human history, not by a clean founding event. The genetics of ancient Americans also reveal something surprising about connectivity. DNA studies have found evidence of long-distance migration and genetic exchange across enormous distances within the pre-Columbian Americas. People were moving. People were in contact across what we think of as vast wilderness. The genetic evidence of connectivity of gene flow between populations, separated by 1,000 miles or more, is consistent with the archaeological evidence of long-distance trade in copper and obsidian and shell and mica. This was not a continent of isolated communities. It was a continent of connected ones. The question is how connected and how organized, and whether the connections were sustained enough and systematic enough to constitute something like a continental network, a web of communication and exchange that linked diverse cultures across enormous distances and created a kind of shared cultural space, however loosely defined, that we would recognize as a civilization if we saw it somewhere else in the world. There is a road in the Atacama Desert of northern Chile that is visible from satellite. It runs arrow straight across the desert floor, connecting two ancient sites, separated by more than 100 miles. It is not a road anyone uses today. It is not a road anyone used in the colonial period. It is a pre-Columbian road, and it is so straight that it had to have been planned with something other than sighting from the ground alone, in a landscape with no prominent landmarks. Maintaining a straight line over 100 miles requires either extraordinary surveying skill or a method of alignment that goes above the ground level. The ancient roads of the Americas in the Atacama, in the Amazon, in the road network of the Chicoan system in New Mexico, all share this quality of precision that is difficult to explain, with the tools we typically attribute to pre-Columbian cultures. The road builders of ancient America were surveyors. They understood geometry. They had methods of maintaining straight lines over long distances. Whether those methods involved astronomical sighting, which is possible, or some form of ground-based triangulation, or some technique we have not yet identified, the results are there in the landscape, speaking for themselves. The mystery of ancient American road systems is inseparable from the mystery of what they connected. Roads are built to facilitate movement between places. The more sophisticated the road, the more regular and organized the movement it was designed to serve. A well-engineered road network implies a well-organized society with regular needs for communication and transport at scales that simple band-level societies do not require. The Chicoan roads implied the Chicoan world. The Amazonian causeways implied the Amazonian cities. The Andean road systems implied the Andean empires. And the existence of pre-Columbian road infrastructure across North America, wherever it is found, implies a level of social organization that demands to be taken seriously. In the Mississippi Valley, the Natchez Trace, which runs for more than 400 miles from what is now Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee, was already an established road when the first European explorers encountered it. The Chickasaw and Chalk and other Native American peoples used it, and it clearly predated their historical period by an unknown but substantial margin. The trace follows a route that connects major springs and navigable waterways, that crosses rivers at their shallowest fording points, that maintains an alignment suggesting systematic planning rather than the gradual accumulation of a game trail. Some archaeologists believe the Natchez Trace traces a route established by the Mississippian civilization by the culture that built Cahokia and the other great mound centers of the interior. If so, it is a piece of pre-Columbian infrastructure that survived into historical times, disguised as a natural path. The question of disguise, of what is hiding in plain sight in the American landscape, is one that haunts American archaeology. How many features of the natural-seeming American landscape are actually products of human intention, of ancient engineering, of a scale of landscape modification that we have not yet learned to recognize? The evidence from the Amazon, where an apparently natural forest turned out to grow over the ruins of a civilization, suggests that this question deserves to be asked much more systematically. Where else are we walking over ancient human construction and mistaking it for nature? There are hills in New England that local traditions describe as old, as having been there since before the memories of any living person that geological analysis has suggested may be artificial. Stone cans on hilltops in Vermont and New Hampshire that look like random accumulations of fieldstone until you notice that they align with each other and with landscape features and with celestial events. Arrangements of stones in the forests of the Appalachian that resemble nothing agricultural or domestic. Underground chambers that predate any colonial farmhouse within miles. The Upton Chamber in Massachusetts is a good example. This is a beehive stone chamber, about 14 feet in diameter, with a cobbled ceiling and a long entrance tunnel. The chamber is aligned so that the setting sun shines directly into it. On the days of the equinoxes, it is built with a degree of skill and care that exceeds anything required for a simple root, cellar, or agricultural storage structure, and it is old. How old is disputed, but like an analysis and soil studies have suggested, pre-colonial construction. The mainstream view remains that it was built by colonial farmers, but the alignment and the quality of construction continue to attract attention from researchers who find the colonial origin explanation insufficient. There are dozens of similar chambers in New England. They form a pattern across the landscape, a pattern that has been mapped and studied by researchers associated with the New England Antiquities Research Association, a group that has spent decades documenting stone structures in the region that they believe predate European settlement. The mainstream archaeological establishment has been largely dismissive of NERA's work, partly because some of its researchers have proposed pre-Columbian Celtic or Phoenician origins for the structures, the theories that most archaeologists find implausible. But the structures themselves, whatever their origin, exist, and the question of who built them and when has not been answered to the satisfaction of everyone who has looked carefully at them. This brings us to the role of fringe research in American archaeology, a role that is both necessary and problematic because the mainstream archaeological establishment has real reasons for its conservatism, for its skepticism of extraordinary claims, for its resistance to revising established narratives without compelling evidence. Archaeology is not immune to the general human desire for exciting stories. The history of the field is peppered with frauds and misidentifications and wishful interpretations that were eagerly embraced and then painfully corrected. The Cardiff Giant, a plaster statue buried and then discovered in New York in 1869, was widely believed to be a petrified ancient human giant before being exposed as a hoax. Piltdown Man, supposedly an early human skull found in England in 1912, turned out to be a forgery that fooled the archaeological establishment for 40 years. The desire to find something extraordinary has repeatedly led people to see what they want to, C. In ambiguous evidence. So, the conservatism of mainstream archaeology is not simply closed-mindedness. It is a reasonable institutional response to a history of being burned by spectacular claims that turned out to be nothing. When a researcher announces that they have found evidence of ancient Celtic contact with North America, or evidence of pre-Columbian Egyptian presence, or evidence of a civilization so advanced that it leaves no recognizable trace, the appropriate response from a scientific community is not excitement, it is skepticism, demand for evidence, peer review, replication, the slow, frustrating machinery of science. The problem is that this appropriate conservatism sometimes becomes something less appropriate. It becomes a prior commitment to the established narrative that resists revision even when the evidence for revision is substantial and has survived serious scrutiny. The treatment of the Monteverde site is instructive. When Tom Diller began publishing evidence of human habitation at Monteverde, predating the Clovis horizon, the response from many in the American archaeological establishment was not measured skepticism. It was sustained, sometimes hostile resistance that went on for more than a decade before the weight of evidence finally forced a revision of the standard model. The researchers who resisted Dillahee were not all acting in bad faith, but they were operating from a prior so strong that it took an extraordinary and extended effort of documentation to override it. The lesson of Monteverde is that the American archaeological establishment, prior, are not always correct, that the standard narrative has been revised before and can be revised again, that anomalous evidence deserves investigation rather than dismissal, because some of that evidence turns out to reflect real discoveries about a past more complex than the models predicted. The deeper we dig into American prehistory, the more we find, and what we find with increasing regularity is not a simpler story than what we expected. It is a more complicated one, a story with more migrations, more contacts, more civilizations, more sophisticated engineering, more astronomical knowledge, more long-distance trade, and more unexplained mysteries than the textbook version of American history could have accommodated. And that story is still being written by archaeologists with their TRS and their carbon dating equipment, by geneticists with their ancient DNA extractions, by physicists with their LIA systems and their isotope analysis, by anthropologists with their interviews of indigenous elders, by the Earth itself, which continues to yield its secrets slowly, grudgingly, one discovery at a time. Let us turn now to something that is not usually discussed in polite archaeological company. Let us talk about the possibility that some of what happened in ancient America was so strange, so outside the frame of any model we have, that we are not yet even asking the right questions. There is a tradition among many indigenous peoples of the Americas that their ancestors came from a place called the underworld. This is not a metaphor for death. It is a literal cosmological statement about the origin of humanity. In Hopi tradition, the current world is the fourth world, and the ancestors of the Hopi emerged from the third world below through an opening in the earth called the Sipu. The Sipu is a real location, a small hole in the floor of the Grand Canyon near the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers. It is sacred. It is visited by Hopi pilgrims. It is in the Hopi worldview the literal point from which their ancestors entered this world. Now you might say this is mythology. This is the kind of creation story that every culture develops to explain its origins and give meaning to its existence. And you would be right, but it is worth pausing on what kind of mythology this is. The Hopi emergence narrative is not a story about divine creation, about a god who made the world from clay or from void. It is a story about migration, about movement from one place to another, about an emergence from below into above. It describes a geological feature. It connects the spiritual to a specific physical location. It is in some readings the kind of myth that might encode a memory of something real, of a historical event so significant that it became the foundation of an entire cosmological system. What would make a people emergence from below the ground a historical event worth mythologizing? Could it represent the emergence of a population from cave dwellers to surface dwellers? Could it represent an emergence from an actual underground habitation? Could it represent the memory of a climate event, a period when the surface was inhospitable and people lived in the great cave systems of the American Southwest, and then, when conditions changed, came out again? These are speculative questions. They may have no satisfying answers, but they point to something interesting about the relationship between indigenous mythology and physical geography in the Americas. The sacred stories of many indigenous peoples are grounded in specific places. The locations they describe are real places. The geological features they incorporate are real geological features. This groundedness suggests that these traditions are not purely invented, that they carry information about real relationships between people and the land they have inhabited for thousands of years. The knowledge encoded in Native American traditions about the natural world has been documented in numerous cases to be accurate in ways that Western science later confirmed. Traditional ecological knowledge about animal behavior, about plant properties, about weather patterns, about geological features accumulated over tens of thousands of years of close observation is in many cases more detailed and more accurate than what Western science knew about these subjects until the late 20th century. If indigenous peoples' knowledge about the natural world is reliable, why should their historical knowledge be assumed to be unreliable? The dismissal of indigenous historical knowledge as myth, while treating European historical records as history, is not a neutral scientific position. It is a culturally freighted one, reflecting assumptions about the relationship between literacy and accuracy, between writing and truth, that are not universally supported by the evidence. Oral traditions can preserve accurate historical information across thousands of years. As the Australian Aboriginal case has demonstrated, the burden of proof for dismissing a specific indigenous historical account lies with the dismisser, not the account. There is a tradition among the Zuri people of New Mexico that speaks of an ancient civilization to the east that was very large and very organized, and that is now gone. There are lot traditions that speak of stone cities in the Black Hills region that predate any historic occupation. There are Cherokee traditions that speak of a people called the Mooney people, white-skinned and blind in daylight, who lived in the Appalachians before the Cherokee arrived and were driven out. These traditions are not proof of the specific things they describe, but they are evidence of a historical sense, a sense that the land has a past that extends far beyond living memory, that things existed and happened, and that the current order of things is not the original order. The Mooney people tradition is particularly intriguing because it appears in the traditions of multiple southeastern tribes, not just the Cherokee, suggesting that it is not a single community's unique account, but something that multiple peoples independently remembered about a shared geographic area. Who the Mooney people were, if they were anything historical rather than purely mythological, is unknown. Various researchers have proposed that they were Celts, or Norse, or an early group of Adena mound builders, or a population with albinism, or any number of other explanations. None of these explanations has compelling evidence behind it, but the tradition exists, and it is consistent across multiple independent accounts, and that is the kind of cross-community consistency that in other contexts would be taken as at least weak evidence of a historical event. Let us think about time for a moment. We have been moving through American prehistory in broad strokes, jumping from 12,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago, and the jumps feel natural because we are used to thinking of deep time as a smooth continuum, from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated. But this mental model may be misleading. Human cognitive capacity has not changed significantly in at least 300,000 years. The brain you are using to listen to this right now is functionally identical to the brain of a human being who lived in Africa 300,000 years ago. The same processing power, the same capacity for language, for pattern recognition, for planning, for creativity, for memory. What has changed over that time is not the brain, but the accumulated store of external knowledge, the tools and techniques and understandings, that each generation builds on the work of the previous one. This means that there is nothing about the human beings who lived in the Americas 20,000 years ago that made them incapable of sophisticated thought, of complex social organization, of technological innovation. They had the same cognitive architecture that built Cho Canyon and the Egyptian pyramids and the International Space Station. What they lacked was not intelligence. What they lacked was the accumulated inheritance of previous technological generations. They were starting in some sense from scratch. But starting from scratch does not mean starting slowly. Under the right conditions, with the right environmental pressures and the right social structures, human beings can develop remarkable complexity in relatively short periods. The Hopewell trade network, which extended across the entire North American continent, developed within a few centuries. Cahokia grew from a small village to the largest city north of Mexico in less than a century. The Chacoan system developed and matured in about 200 years. Human cultural evolution, when conditions are right, can be extraordinarily rapid. This means that there could have been cycles of complexity in American prehistory, periods of rapid development, followed by catastrophic collapse, followed by recovery, and redevelopment that we are only beginning to detect. If a civilization rises and falls completely within a few centuries and leaves only earthworks and scattered artifacts that are subsequently misidentified as natural features, it may leave very little in the way of recognizable evidence. We might walk over its ruins for centuries without realizing what we are walking over. This has happened. It is happening. It will probably happen again. The possibility of lost civilizations in the Americas, civilizations sophisticated enough to have been genuinely remarkable but poorly represented in the surviving record because of the conditions of their collapse and the subsequent destruction of the physical evidence, is not a fringe idea. It is a serious archaeological hypothesis that is gaining ground as new discoveries continue to reveal greater complexity in the American past than previous models predicted. What might such a lost civilization look like? It might not look like Egypt or Rome or any of the old world civilizations we use as our models for what civilization is. It might be organized differently, built from different materials, expressed in different media. It might be a civilization of earthworks rather than stone buildings, a civilization whose monuments are so thoroughly merged with the landscape that we look at them and see hills. It might be a civilization whose greatest achievements were social and intellectual rather than architectural, whose legacy is in the cosmological traditions and the astronomical knowledge and the ecological management practices that were transmitted to successor cultures and are still in some form present in the indigenous traditions of the continent today. The recognition that civilization can take many forms, that the criteria we use to identify ancient civilizations, writing, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, urban centers, need not be the only possible forms of sophisticated social organization, is one of the more significant intellectual shifts in archaeology in the past generation. The Amazon cities reveal a civilization organized around hydraulic engineering and soil management rather than stone monuments. Chaco reveals a civilization organized around astronomy and ritual rather than military power. Cahokia reveals a civilization that could build monuments comparable to those of early Egypt, using entirely different materials and methods. None of these look exactly like what we thought civilization was supposed to look like. All of them are unmistakably civilizations. There is a place in Louisiana called Poverty Point. The name is a product of the antebellum South's habit of naming things ironically and without much imagination, and it tells you nothing about what the site actually is. What the site actually is one of the largest and most elaborate ceremonial complexes in pre-Columbian North America. Built by a people who lived in the lower Mississippi Valley roughly 3,500 years ago, centuries before the Hopewell tradition, more than a millennium before Cahokia, Poverty Point consists of a series of enormous earthen ridges arranged in concentric arcs around a central plaza, plus several large mounds, including a bird-shaped mound that is one of the largest earthen structures in prehistoric North America. The ridge system alone involved moving more than 2 million cubic feet of earth, a construction project requiring thousands of workers over many generations. The site was a hub of a trade network that extended from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachian, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. What makes Poverty Point extraordinary beyond its scale and its trade connections is its age. 3,500 years ago, this is earlier than many people expect. Complex civilization to appear in North America. The conventional timeline places the development of complex society in North America several centuries later in the Adena and Hopewell traditions of the first millennium BCE. Poverty Point predates those traditions by 1,000 years. It suggests that the trajectory of North American cultural development was not a gradual, upward slope from simple to complex, but something more like a series of peaks of experiments in complexity that rose and fell and rose again in different places and different forms. The people who built Poverty Point were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, or more precisely, they were fisher-hunter-gatherers, exploiting the extraordinary abundance of the Mississippi River Delta with a sophistication that allowed them to support a substantial permanent population without intensive agriculture. They were, by any reasonable definition, a complex society, organized, hierarchical to some degree, capable of massive, coordinated labor, connected to a continental trade network, and they did all of this before agriculture, before the development of the ceramic technology that we typically associate with complex societies, before many of the supposed prerequisites for civilization existed in the region. Poverty Point is a reminder that the categories we use to think about ancient societies, hunter-gatherer versus agricultural, simple versus complex, primitive versus civilized, are deeply inadequate to the reality of what actually happened in human history. The people of the Mississippi Delta 3,500 years ago do not fit any of these categories neatly. They were something more complicated and more interesting than any of our categories can accommodate. North of Poverty Point in the interior of the continent, another set of mysteries waits in the rock. The petroglyphs of North America are among the most extensive and least understood bodies of ancient art in the world. Hundreds of thousands of images carved and pecked and painted on rock surfaces across the patch and continent, from the Columbian Plateau of Washington State to the canyons of New Mexico to the Great Plains, to the Appalachian Highlands. These images span enormous ranges of time, with some of the oldest dating back more than 10,000 years, and some of the most recent made in the historical period by peoples whose descendants are still alive. What do these images mean? In most cases we do not know. The people who made them did not leave written explanations. The oral traditions that might have explained their meaning have in many cases been severed by the disruptions of the colonial period. What remains is the images themselves, extraordinarily diverse, sometimes figurative and sometimes abstract, sometimes depicting recognizable animals, and sometimes depicting geometric forms or humanoid figures with unusual features. Some of the most striking and most debated petroglyphs are found in the American Southwest, particularly in the canyon country of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. The Barrier Canyon style found across a large area of the Colorado Plateau depicts strange elongated humanoid figures, often without arms, sometimes with antennae or other non-human features. These figures, which can be enormous, covering entire canyon walls, have a quality that is simultaneously alien and deeply human. They convey a sense of significance, of intentionality, of meaning carefully constructed and carefully expressed. What they meant to the people who made them 10,000 years ago, or whenever these images were created, is genuinely unknown. Some researchers have interpreted these figures as representations of spiritual beings, of supernatural entities encountered in shamanic trance states. Others see them as depictions of actual beings, as the memory of encounters with something unusual, something outside the normal range of human experience. The interpretations range from the spiritually orthodox to the genuinely radical, and the evidence does not allow us to choose definitively between them. The Newspaper Rock in Utah is a single sandstone surface covered with hundreds of toined petroglyphs made over a period of more than 2,000 years. A kind of palimpsest of imagery, in which newer images are layered over older ones, creating a record of long-term human engagement with a specific place. Among the images at Newspaper Rock are figures that look like nothing in the natural world of the Colorado Plateau. Figures with round heads and large eyes. Figures with apparent suits or uniforms. Figures that, seen without preconceptions, might cause a first-time visitor to wonder what they are looking at. I am not going to tell you that these figures represent ancient astronauts. The ancient astronaut hypothesis is not supported by any serious archaeological evidence. It is a story that satisfies a desire for cosmic drama at the cost of the far more interesting and more complex truth of what ancient human beings actually achieved by themselves without help from outside. What I will tell you is that the figures at Newspaper Rock and at dozens of other sites across the American Southwest represent something that the people who made them considered significant enough to carve permanently into stone, and that we do not know what that something was. That ignorance is the real mystery, not the exotic speculation about what the figures might represent, but the genuine, irreducible fact that some of the most important communications that ancient Americans left for the future are ones we cannot read. There is a canyon in New Mexico called Shoculture National Historical Park, which we have already visited. But there is something else in the region, something that has received somewhat less attention. In the area around Choco, distributed across the surrounding desert, are dozens of small rooms carved into cliff faces and canyon walls. These rooms are too small for habitation. Many of them can only be reached by climbing routes that would challenge an experienced, technical climber. They contain, when they are examined, small caches of objects, corn cobs, small figurines, prayer sticks, feathers. They were not living spaces. They were places of offering, places where something was left for something or someone who was expected to receive it. What was expected to receive these offerings? In the worldview of the ancestral Pueblones, the world was full of beings, spirits, forces, intelligences that inhabited every significant feature of the landscape. The high places, the deep places, the rivers, the springs, the keva, the ceremonial chamber, were all considered inhabited by presences that needed to be acknowledged, appeased, communicated with. The inaccessible cache rooms in the cliffs above Cho were not inaccessible to what they were intended for. They were placed high in places of power, in a cosmological geography that organized the world differently from the one we inhabit. This cosmological geography is not unique to the ancestral Pueblones. It is one of the most consistent features of indigenous cultures across North America. The land is not dead matter. It is living. It is inhabited by intelligences and forces that require relationship, not exploitation. This understanding, which modern Western culture is only beginning to rediscover in the form of environmental philosophy and ecological ethics, was the baseline understanding of virtually every pre-Columbian culture in the Americas. And it was the basis on which these cultures organized their lives, their architecture, their trade networks, their kendrical systems, their everything. When we look at the mounds and the chambers and the roads and the effigy earthworks of ancient North America, we are looking at a civilization organized around an understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world they inhabit. That is profoundly different from the understanding that has shaped Western civilization for the past few centuries. We are looking at the physical expression of a cosmology in which human beings are participants in a living universe, not managers of a dead one. And we are looking at evidence that this cosmology was sophisticated enough and organized enough to produce achievements of engineering and astronomy and art that we are still struggling to fully understand and explain. The deeper we dig into American prehistory, the more this becomes clear. The question is not whether ancient America was sophisticated. It was. The question is how sophisticated, in what ways, to what extent, and by what means. And those questions remain stubbornly and fascinatingly open. There is a story the Great Plains tell in the language of grass and sky and bone. It is one of the oldest stories in North America, told not in written words or carved stone, but in the preserved remains of animals and the preserved landscape of an ecosystem that was before European settlement one of the most extraordinary environments on the planet. The Great Plains in 1491 were home to something between 30 and 60 million bison. This is a number that is almost impossible to visualize. 60 million bison moving across a landscape that stretched from Canada to Texas, from the Rockies to the Mississippi, herds so large that they took days to pass a given point, a biomass of grazing animals that had no parallel anywhere else on Earth. And surrounding and managing an existing and complex relationship with that biomass were the plains, peoples, cultures that had developed over thousands of years. The most sophisticated system of ecological management of large mammals that the world has ever seen. The buffalo jump is the most famous example of this management system. A buffalo jump is a cliff face, sometimes reinforced with stone cans and funnel-shaped drive, lanes extending for miles across the prairie, used to stampede herds of bison to their deaths. Organized mass kills. The oldest buffalo jumps in North America date back more than 10,000 years. They were used consistently across this entire period, modified and improved and adapted to changing conditions, representing one of the longest running examples of sustained ecological management in human history. The buffalo jump is not a primitive technology, it is a sophisticated one. It requires detailed knowledge of bison behavior, of the landscape, of weather conditions, of seasonal migration patterns. It requires organization, the coordination of dozens or hundreds of people playing specific roles in the drive, acting in concert at precisely the right moment. It requires knowledge accumulated over many generations and transmitted through oral, tradition, and direct apprenticeship. The people who ran the buffalo jumps of the ancient plains were experts. They were specialists. They were practitioners of a technology as complex in its own domain as anything produced by the civilizations of the old world. And the buffalo was not merely food. The relationship between the plains peoples and the bison was one of the most comprehensive and complete relationships between a human culture and an animal species ever documented. Every part of the bison was used. The meat was eaten fresh, or dried, or processed into pemmican. The hide was tanned for clothing and shelter. The bones were made into tools and weapons. The sinew was used for bowstrings and thread. The stomach and bladder were used as cooking vessels and water containers. The tongue was a delicacy. The brain was used in the tanning process. The chips of dried dung were burned as fuel in a treeless landscape. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. The relationship was total. This relationship was also in the understanding of the plains peoples themselves, a spiritual one. The bison was not merely a resource. It was a relative, a being with its own life, and its own will, and its own spiritual significance. The hunt was not merely an economic activity. It was a ceremony, surrounded by ritual and prayer, and acknowledgement of the sacrifice the animal was making. This is not merely sentiment. The spiritual relationship with the bison shaped the practices that made the relationship sustainable. A culture that regarded the bison as a relative, that approached the hunt with ceremony and constraint was less likely to deplete the resource than a culture that regarded the bison as simply a commodity. The destruction of the bison in the 19th century by American hunters, reducing a population of 60 million to fewer than 1,000 in less than 3 decades, was one of the most rapid ecological catastrophes in human history. And it was not accidental. The United States Army and the federal government actively encouraged the destruction of the buffalo herds as a strategy for destroying the plains cultures that depended on them. General William Tecumseh Sherman explicitly stated that the quickest way to compel the plains peoples to accept reservation life was to destroy the bison. This is documented. It is not contested. The destruction of the bison was deliberate policy, a biological weapon deployed against human beings by removing the foundation of their civilization. The civilization that was destroyed, the culture of the plains peoples, at its height in the 18th and early 19th centuries, was itself something remarkable. It was not the original culture of the plains, horses, which transformed plains culture so completely that the horse-based buffalo hunt seems ancient and original, were actually reintroduced to North America by the Spanish in the 16th century. The horse had been native to North America and had gone extinct at the end of the last ice age along with the mammoth and the mastodon and the ground sloth and a dozen other large American mammals. When the Spanish brought horses north from Mexico, Native American cultures adapted to the animal with extraordinary speed, developing within a few generations a horse-based culture of such sophistication that it appeared to European observers as something that had always been there. The speed of the plains culture's adaptation to the horse is itself evidence of the kind of rapid cultural innovation that characterizes human beings under conditions of opportunity. Within 2 or 3 generations of acquiring horses, cultures like the Comanche, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapjo had developed entirely new military and hunting techniques, new social structures adapted to mobility, new artistic traditions expressing the new relationship between human and animal. This was not slow cultural evolution. This was rapid, deliberate, creative adaptation, and it produced in less than a century cultures of remarkable complexity and sophistication. But the horse culture of the historic plains was built on a foundation that was much older. The knowledge of bison behavior, the organization of the hunt, the ecological understanding of the plains ecosystem, the spiritual frameworks that governed the relationship between people and bison. All of these were ancient, accumulated over thousands of years, adapted and refined by countless generations before the horse arrived. The horse was a tool, a transformative and extraordinary tool, but the knowledge it was applied to was the product of a civilization stretching back into the deep past. There is something in the grass of the Great Plains that knows this. The deep root systems of the prairie grasses, extending sometimes more than 15 feet into the earth, hold the soil against the wind in ways that nothing planted by European farmers has ever matched. The Great Prairies of North America are a product of thousands of years of co-evolution between grasses, bison, fire, and the human beings who managed all three. The plains peoples used fire regularly and deliberately to manage the landscape, to direct the movement of bison herds, to clear old growth and encourage the new grass that the bison preferred. The prairie itself was in some measure a product of indigenous land management. The landscape European settlers moved into was not a wilderness. It was like the Amazon, a managed landscape shaped by human intention over thousands of years. When the management stopped, the landscape changed. The bison were gone. The fires were suppressed. The grasses that had co-evolved with regular burning and heavy grazing began to change. The prairie ecosystem that had seemed so permanent and so natural turned out to be partly a product of human culture. And without the human component, it was vulnerable in ways it had not been for thousands of years. This is a pattern that appears across North America wherever we look closely enough. The landscapes that European settlers took to be natural wilderness were in many cases cultural landscapes shaped by thousands of years of deliberate human management. The forests of New England were maintained by regular burning that encouraged the growth of nut, trees, and berries, and kept the undergrowth manageable. The river systems of the Pacific Northwest were managed to maintain salmon populations. The marshes and wetlands of the Mississippi Delta were shaped by generations of human activity. The American landscape in 1491 was not pristine. It was a garden different in type from the gardens of Europe and Asia, but no less the product of deliberate human cultivation. When Europeans arrived and the indigenous populations collapsed, the management stopped. The forests grew dense, the rivers changed course, the marshes silted up or dried out. The landscape reverted to something that looked to European eyes like wilderness. But it was not wilderness. It was an abandoned garden. And a great deal of what we value about the American natural environment today, from the national parks to the old-growth forests to the river ecosystems, is the product of that abandoned garden. Its remarkable capacity for recovery in the 5 centuries since the management stopped. This matters for how we understand ancient America because it tells us that the people who lived on this continent for tens of thousands of years before European contact were not passive inhabitants of a natural environment. They were active shapers of it. They were, in the most literal sense, civilization. Not in the narrow sense of cities and writing and bronze weapons, but in the broader and perhaps more important sense of a sustained, organized, intergenerational human effort to understand and manage the relationship between people and the world they inhabit. The Pacific Northwest coast of North America is one of the most resource-rich environments in the world. The combination of cold, nutrient-rich ocean water, extensive river systems, dense forest, and extraordinary seasonal abundance of salmon created the conditions for human cultures of remarkable complexity without intensive agriculture. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka, the New Charal, and dozens of other cultures developed social structures, artistic traditions, and cosmological systems of extraordinary sophistication in an environment that provided enough food wealth that they could afford to invest enormous energy in cultural production. The totem poles of the Northwest coast are perhaps the most immediately recognizable product of this cultural wealth. These carved cedar monuments, some rising to 50 or 60 feet, encode family histories, clan lineages, and cosmological narratives in a visual language that is simultaneously highly specific and deeply complex. To read a totem pole correctly, you need to know the specific visual vocabulary of the culture that made it, the meaning of each figure, each gesture, each compositional arrangement. The poles are texts, genealogical and cosmological texts, written in the language of form and image rather than alphabet and word. The artistic tradition of the Northwest coast is one of the most sophisticated artistic traditions in the world, comparable in its formal rigor and its expressive range to the greatest artistic traditions of any other civilization. The characteristic ovoid shapes, the transformation imagery in which one being contains or becomes another, the complex arrangements of figures that pack meaning into every square inch of surface, represent an aesthetic and conceptual achievement that has influenced modern art profoundly. From surrealism to abstract expressionism, Northwest Coast art is not decorative. It is a system of thought expressed in visual form, a way of saying things about identity and power and relationship and cosmology that words alone cannot say. The potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest Coast peoples are another expression of the same cultural wealth. A potlatch is a feast and gift-giving ceremony in which the host demonstrates social status not by accumulating wealth, but by giving it away. The most prestigious host is the one who gives the most, whose generosity is most extravagant, who distributes the greatest wealth to guests, and thereby establishes a social credit that elevates their position in the community. This is an economic system built on exactly the opposite principles from the Western, capitalist system. Status through distribution rather than accumulation, power through generosity rather than possession. The potlatch was outlawed by the Canadian government in 1885 and by American authorities in the same period on the grounds that it was wasteful, that it prevented the accumulation of capital that industrial development required, and that it reinforced traditional social structures that stood in the way of assimilation. The ceremonies continued underground, practiced in secret, maintained by the communities that refused to abandon them despite legal prohibition. The law was finally repealed in Canada in 1951. The potlatch tradition survived. What is remarkable about the potlatch prohibition is what it reveals about the relationship between cultural difference and colonial power. The Canadian and American governments outlawed a ceremony not because it caused harm, but because it embodied a different understanding of the relationship between wealth and social cups that was incompatible with the economic ideology of industrial capitalism. The ceremony was threatening, not because it was violent or dangerous, but because it represented an alternative way of organizing human social life that, if widely adopted, would have undermined the foundations of the economic system the colonizers were trying to extend. across the continent. This points to something that is often overlooked in discussions of pre-Columbian America. The civilizations of ancient North America were not merely different from European civilization in superficial ways. They were different in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions of European culture about the proper relationship between human beings and the natural world, between individuals and communities, between wealth and status, between the living and the dead. This is why they were not merely conquered, but systematically destroyed. Not just defeated militarily, but deliberately dismantled culturally, legally, linguistically, spiritually. The boarding school system that removed indigenous children from their families and forbade them to speak their languages or practice their traditions was not an accident of cultural misunderstanding. It was a deliberate policy of cultural annihilation. The recognition of this history is still in many parts of North America uncomfortable and incomplete. The comfortable story of American history, the story of discovery and settlement and progress and freedom, cannot coexist comfortably with the story of what was destroyed to make it possible. The two stories compete for the same space, and the more honestly we tell the second story, the more we understand the first story for what it is. But even in the destruction, things survived. Languages persist, sometimes only in the memories of a handful of elderly speakers, sometimes in communities of thousands. Ceremonial traditions persist, maintained through generations of suppression. Ecological knowledge persists in the practices of communities that never stopped managing the land according to traditional principles, even when they were prevented from doing so openly. And the physical record persists in the ground and the rock and the stars, waiting for the technology and the questions that will reveal what it has to say. One of the most exciting developments in American archaeology in the past decade has been the application of LAR technology to previously unsurveyed areas. LIDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, is a remote sensing technique that uses laser pulses to map the ground surface beneath vegetation. When you fly a LAR sensor over a forested area, you get a point cloud of returns that, when processed, shows you the bare earth beneath the trees. And what the bare earth shows in area after area across North America is extraordinary. In the American Southeast, LAR surveys are revealing the full extent of the Mississippian landscape, showing not just the mounds that have been known for centuries, but the entire organized landscape of fields, roads, and community structures that surrounded them. The picture that emerges from these surveys is of a landscape as thoroughly humanized as any in the Old World, organized with the same care and deliberateness as the cultural landscapes of medieval Europe or ancient China. In the Pacific Northwest, LIDAR is revealing ancient village sites, fish weir systems, and modified landscapes that document the scale and sophistication of coastal resource management across thousands of years. In the Great Basin, it is revealing ancient trail systems and water management features that completely transform our understanding of how people survived in one of the most challenging environments in North America. And in the Midwest, LIDAR is doing something even more extraordinary. It is revealing the full extent of the earthwork complexes that the historic record only partially documented. We knew about Cahokia, we knew about Newark, we knew about Serpent Mound, but LIDAR is showing us that these famous sites were nodes in a much larger network of earthwork construction, that the mound-building tradition was more extensive, more systematic, and more geographically comprehensive than anyone had previously realized. The picture of ancient North America that is emerging from these new technologies is not smaller and simpler than what we expected. It is vastly larger and more complex. The continent was full, it was managed, it was organized, it was sophisticated in ways we are still learning to recognize and to measure. Let us go now to the desert of the American Southwest, one more time, and let us ask a question that has been sitting at the edge of everything we have discussed. A question about water. Water is the most fundamental resource in any human landscape. The presence or absence of reliable water determines everything else. Where settlements can exist, how large they can grow, what agricultural systems are possible, what trade routes can be established. In the arid American Southwest, Water management is not an optional refinement of the agricultural system. It is the agricultural system. And the ancient peoples of the Southwest managed water with a sophistication that modern, hydraulic engineers have studied and admired. The Huam people, who flourished in the Sonoran Desert of what is now Arizona between roughly 1 CE and 1450 CE, constructed an irrigation canal system that at its peak extent covered more than 800 meters of canals across the Sultan Gila River valleys. These canals, some of them 20 feet deep and 80 feet wide, were excavated entirely by hand with stone and bone and wooden tools. They were engineered with precise gradients that maintained water flow over long distances without erosion. They irrigated a desert landscape and supported a population of perhaps 50,000 people in a Puerto region that without human intervention could support almost none. The engineering precision of the Huam Canal system impressed the American engineers and army officers who surveyed it in the 19th century. When Phoenix, Arizona was founded and expanded in the late 19th century, it was built on top of the Hohokam Canal system, reusing the ancient alignments as the framework for modern irrigation. The Phoenix metropolitan area, one of the largest and fastest-growing cities in the United States, sits on a foundation of pre-Columbian hydraulic engineering. The city is in some measure possible because the Hohokam were brilliant engineers, and like every other complex civilization we have discussed, the Huam collapsed. Around 1450 CE, the major Huam centers were abandoned. The canal system fell into disuse and the population dispersed. The causes are debated, among them drought, flooding, social conflict, soil salinization from over-irrigation. The Odum people, the modern indigenous inhabitants of the Sonoran Desert region, are widely believed to be descendants of the Huam, and their traditions carry the memory of what happened in the collapse in the form of stories about the abandonment of the great houses and the dispersal of the people. The collapse of the Huam is another case where a civilization of genuine sophistication and scale simply disappeared from the archaeological record within a century or two, leaving behind evidence so thoroughly reinterpreted and built over that it took centuries of archaeological investigation to recognize what it was. The Phoenix metropolitan area obliterates daily, through ordinary construction and development, fragments of the world that the Hohokam built. Every foundation dug for a new building is a potential encounter with ancient canals or middens, or features of the Hohokam landscape. Some of these encounters are documented and preserved, many are not. This is the condition of American archaeology across most of the continent. The past is being destroyed faster than it is being discovered. Development, agriculture, urbanization, erosion, and climate change are all eating away at the physical record of ancient America at a rate that exceeds our capacity to document it. The decisions being made today about what to preserve and what to allow to be destroyed are determining what future generations will be able to know about the deep past of this continent. The stakes of those decisions are not merely academic. The story of ancient America is the story of what human beings are capable of building and sustaining in the long term. It is the story of how civilizations rise and fall, and what the conditions of their success and failure have been. It is a story with genuine lessons for a civilization that is currently facing questions about its own sustainability, its own relationship to the natural systems it depends on, its own capacity to plan and coordinate across generations for a future it will not live to see. There is a specific quality of silence that belongs to ancient places. You can find it at Cho Canyon on a windless morning when the sun has not yet reached the canyon floor and the massive stone walls of the great houses are still in shadow. You can find it in the fields above Newark, Ohio, where the earthen banks of the Octagon rise out of the grass and the golf course fairways, and you can almost with effort recover a sense of what this place once was. You can find it at Monk's Mound in Illinois, standing at the summit of the largest pre-Columbian structure in North America and looking out over the Mississippi River floodplain and the St. Louis skyline. The silence has a texture to it in these places, a weight, a sense of something having happened here that has not finished happening. This is not mysticism, or it is not merely mysticism. It is the appropriate response to scale. When you stand in a place where hundreds of thousands of people lived and worked and built and died over centuries, the residue of that history is real. Even if it is not physically visible, it is in the measurements of the architecture. It is in the alignments of the earthworks. It is in the specific orientation of a doorway toward a specific point on the horizon, where a specific astronomical event occurs at a specific time of year. These things are deliberate. They are the product of intentions so sustained and so precise that it persists across 1,000 years, legible to anyone who knows how to look. The ancient peoples of North America were trying to say something with what they built, and what they were saying is recoverable, at least in part. The astronomers who study the alignments of Choco and Newark are recovering it. The archaeologists who map the extent of Cahokia's Plaza system are recovering it. The genetic researchers who trace the movements of ancient populations are recovering it. The linguists who study the distributions and relationships of indigenous languages are recovering it. The anthropologists who work with indigenous communities to document traditional knowledge are recovering it. The story of ancient America is being recovered piece by piece, slowly, and with enormous effort from a fragmentary and partially destroyed record. It is not a finished story. It is a story in progress, and the most interesting chapters have not been written yet. But we know enough already to say certain things with confidence. We know that people have lived on the American continents for at least 20,000 years, and probably much longer. We know that those people developed over the course of those millennia civilizations of remarkable sophistication in multiple regions simultaneously. We know that they had extensive trade networks, astronomical knowledge, engineering capabilities, and social complexity that far exceed what the conventional picture of pre-Columbian North America suggests. We know that much of this was destroyed by the events of the past 5 centuries, and that much of what survived is only now being fully recognized and documented. We know that the story we were told is incomplete. We know that the incompleteness is not accidental, and we know that the fuller, stranger, more complex story that is emerging from the ongoing work of archaeology and genetics and linguistics and anthropology is both more honest and more interesting than the one it is replacing. There are things we do not know. We do not know the full extent of pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and the Old World. We do not know the complete genetic history of the founding populations of the Americas. We do not know what all the petroglyphs mean, or what all the great mounds were used for, or what caused the specific collapses of specific civilizations at specific times. We do not know whether any of the anomalous skeletal remains reported in the 19th century represent anything unusual, or whether they are all misidentifications and exaggerations. We do not know where all the Lake Superior copper went. These unknowns are not embarrassments. They are invitations. Every unknown in ancient American history is a question waiting to be answered by someone with the curiosity to ask it, the skills to investigate it, and the honesty to report what they find, regardless of whether the answer fits the model they started with. The model has been wrong before. It will be wrong again. The story of ancient America is larger than any model has yet captured. The deeper we dig, the more we find. The more we find, the stranger the story becomes. And the stranger the story becomes, the more it reveals about what human beings actually are, what we are capable of, how long we have been doing remarkable things, and how much of what we have done has already been forgotten. There is a kind of comfort in this, not the comfort of simple answers or clean narratives, but the comfort of genuine mystery, the comfort of knowing that the world is far larger and far older and far more full of human effort and human achievement than we have been told. The comfort of knowing that somewhere under the suburbs of Ohio and the parking lots of Missouri and the golf courses of Mississippi, there are stones arranged by human hands according to a design we are still working to understand, aligned with stars and seasons, built to last, cellophane. And as we come toward the end of this long walk through the mysteries of ancient America, it seems right to return to where we began, to the question of what it means to look at a landscape and ask what happened here before the history we were taught began. What it means is this. It means taking seriously the possibility that the past is more complex than the story we inherited. It means being willing to hold uncertainty without filling it with false certainty. Whether the false certainty of the conventional model or the false certainty of exotic fringe theories, it means honoring the people who built the things we are only now beginning to fully understand by taking their achievements seriously, by studying them with the same rigor and the same respect we bring to the achievements of any other civilization. It means listening to the people who are the living descendants of those builders who carry in their traditions and their memories and their bodies, the inheritance of everything that was built and everything that was destroyed. And it means accepting that the story is not over, that the ground beneath our feet still has things to say, that the next LAR survey, or the next ancient DNA study, or the next careful excavation of a previously ignored site may reveal something that changes everything we thought we knew. Again, this is the nature of genuine inquiry. Not the settling of questions, but the asking of better ones. Not the arrival at final answers, but the recognition that the questions themselves, asked honestly and pursued carefully, are where the real knowledge lives. The moon is rising now, over whatever landscape you are in. The same moon that rose over Cho Canyon 1,000 years ago, that illuminated the lunar alignments of the Newark earthworks, when the priests gathered at the octagon on a cold November night, 18 centuries ago. That shone on the copper-laden trading canoes making their way down the Ohio River toward the Mississippi. That lit the faces of the people who painted the horses at Chauvet, and the figures at Barrier Canyon, and the spirals at Chaco. The same moon, the same sky, a different world beneath it, or the same world seen from a different distance. Sleep well, the mysteries will still be here in the morning. The stars above you tonight are the same stars that the ancient sky watchers of Cahokia and Choco, and the Big Horn medicine wheel, studied and measured and embedded in stone. They have not changed. What has changed is our understanding of the people who studied them. And that understanding is deepening year by year, discovery by discovery, as the ground gives up its secrets and the sky reveals what it has always been showing to anyone who looked up with careful eyes. There is so much we do not know about ancient America. There is so much that has been lost, deliberately and accidentally, through violence and neglect, and the simple passage of time. But there is also increasingly so much we do know, so much that has been recovered from the earth, and from the sky, and from the careful work of researchers who refuse to accept that the obvious questions were not worth asking. The story is not finished. The digging continues, and every year, what comes up from the ground is stranger and more extraordinary and more human than what we expected. This is the deepest truth about ancient America. It was built by human beings, with human hands and human minds, out of human understanding of the world they inhabited and the cosmos they were part of. It was remarkable, it was complex, it was largely destroyed, and it is piece by piece being found again. That finding is one of the great adventures of our time, and it is happening right now in laboratories and in fields and in canyons and in caves all across the extraordinary continent whose deep past we have only just begun to understand. Good night. The mounds are patient. The stones are still aligned. The sky is the same sky. And somewhere underground that looks ordinary and unremarkable, something extraordinary is waiting to be found. There is a specific weight to the word ancient that we do not always feel. We say it, and it passes through the mind like water, leaving nothing behind. Ancient, old, long ago. The words are true, but they do not do the work that the reality requires. They do not carry the full measure of what it means for human beings to have lived on a continent for tens of thousands of years, building and learning and forgetting and rebuilding, creating systems of knowledge and systems of meaning and systems of exchange that stretched across distances so vast that even in the modern age of jet travel and satellite communication, we sometimes struggle to coordinate across them. Let us try once more to feel the time. If you started walking backward from the present moment, going back through history 1 year at a time, you would pass through 2 world wars and a pandemic, and the invention of the telephone, and the American Civil War, and the Declaration of Independence. You had passed through the last Norse voyages to Greenland, and the Mongol conquest of China, and the building of Chartres Cathedral, and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You had passed through the life of Julius Caesar, and the construction of the Colosseum, and the writing of the Iliad. All of that, 2,500 years of history in a single direction. Now keep going. Keep walking backward. You pass through the Bronze Age collapse, through the New Kingdom of Egypt, through the earliest known writing in Mesopotamia. You pass through the building of the Great Pyramid and the development of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. You passed through the last Ice Age and the extinctions of the Pleistocene megapora, and still you are not at the beginning of human presence in the Americas. You are somewhere in the middle of it. This is what 20,000 years means. This is what it means to be an ancient civilization. And the people who built the mounds and the chambers and the earthworks and the cities of pre-Columbian North America did so in the middle of this time, not at the beginning of it. They inherited thousands of years of knowledge and practice and cultural development from the people who came before them, and they passed on what they built and learned to the people who came after. The chain of human presence in the Americas is a chain so long and so continuous that it makes the written history of any civilization in the Old World look brief by comparison. This perspective matters. It matters because it changes the question we are asking when we ask about ancient America. We are not asking about a primitive people taking their first steps towards civilization. We are asking about civilizations in the middle of their history. Civilizations that had already been building and experimenting and developing for thousands of years before the specific cultures we know about from the archaeological record came into existence. The Hopewell people, whom we think of as ancient, were building on a foundation that was already millennia old. The Cahokians were heirs to a tradition of mound building that had been running for 2,000 years before their city rose on the Mississippi floodplain. The Chacoan architects were working within a tradition of observation and alignment and ceremonial construction that had been developing in the American Southwest for centuries before the great houses took their final form. The depth of the human tradition in North America is one of the things that most deeply distinguishes this continent's pre-Columbian history from the way it is typically presented. It is not a history that began with the cultures we know about. Those cultures were inheritors. They were children of a past that stretched back beyond the reach of the archaeological record we have so far assembled. And that past, the deep past before the mounds and the great houses, and the copper trade, and the astronomical alignments we can study, may have contained developments and achievements, and losses that we will never be able to reconstruct. The question of what was known and then forgotten in the Americas is one of the most haunting in the entire field of human prehistory. Every complex civilization carries with it knowledge that is maintained only by the institutions that produce and transmit it. When those institutions collapse, the knowledge can disappear. The Library of Alexandria, to use the most famous example from the Old World, held knowledge that was never recovered after its destruction. The tablets of Ugarit, the astronomical records of the Maya, the Quipu records of the Inca, all represent bodies of knowledge that were partially or completely lost when the civilizations that maintained them collapsed or were destroyed. What knowledge was maintained in pre-Columbian North America and then lost in the collapses that punctuated its history is something we can only speculate about. But we can observe something interesting. The cultures that succeeded each other in the American archaeological record often seem to have preserved certain types of knowledge better than others. Astronomical knowledge embedded in the alignment of physical structures survived the all collapses that destroyed the social institutions that originally produced it. The alignments of Cahokia and Newark and Chaco and the medicine wheels of the plains are still legible in the landscape because they were encoded in stone and earth rather than in perishable documents or fragile institutional memory. But other types of knowledge, botanical knowledge, medical knowledge, agricultural techniques, the specifics of ecological management, all of these required living practitioners and ongoing institutions to maintain them, and they were vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic population loss that the American past repeatedly saw. This observation has practical implications for how we think about indigenous knowledge today. The knowledge that survived into the historical period in the traditions of specific communities is the knowledge that proved most robust, most transmissible, most deeply embedded in practice and ceremony and material culture. The knowledge that was lost in the various collapses of pre-Columbian American civilization was knowledge that did not have adequate mechanisms for preservation across catastrophic interruptions in social continuity. And the knowledge that was lost in the post-Colian catastrophe was all the knowledge that could not survive the specific conditions of colonial disruption, which were different from, and in some ways, more severe than any previous disruption. This matters because it means that the surviving indigenous knowledge traditions are not simply remnants or survivals. They are the knowledge that proved most capable of surviving under conditions of extreme stress, and that capability is itself a kind of wisdom. The knowledge that is still held in living communities today is knowledge that has proven itself across multiple catastrophic tests. It is worth treating with extraordinary respect. Let us talk about a specific kind of knowledge that has proven remarkably robust across the American past: the knowledge of the sky. The sky is the one thing that colonization could not destroy. The stars are the same stars. The sun follows the same path. The moon runs its same cycles. Whatever happened to the people who observed the sky itself was unchanged. And the knowledge encoded in the alignments of physical structures, in the orientation of doorways, in the layout of great plazas, and the positions of mounds and the arrangement of stone circles persisted in the landscape, because the landscape itself persisted. This is why the astronomical knowledge of ancient North America is recoverable in ways that other types of knowledge are not. We can measure the alignments of Chacoan great houses and determine that they encode knowledge of the solar and lunar cycles. We can survey the Newark octagon and determine that it encodes knowledge of the lunar standstill cycle. We can analyze the geometry of Cahokia's Woodhenge and determine that it was used to observe the equinoxes and solstices. This knowledge is recoverable because it was encoded in physical structures that survived. What does it tell us? It tells us that the peoples who built these structures had systematic astronomical knowledge accumulated over many generations. It tells us that this knowledge was considered important enough to justify the enormous labor of encoding it in monumental earthworks. It tells us that there were specialists in astronomical observation, people whose role in their communities was to track the sky and maintain the knowledge of celestial cycles. And it tells us that this knowledge was connected to the religious and ceremonial life of these communities in ways so fundamental that the arrangement of the entire built environment reflected the structure of the cosmos. This is not primitive stargazing. This is systematic observational astronomy, embedded in a comprehensive cosmological worldview. It is not the same as Western astronomy, which developed from different cultural roots and with different tools. But it is equally sophisticated in its own terms, and it tells us things about the universe that Western astronomy is only now catching up to. The long-term observation records implicit in the alignment of monuments to events like the lunar standstill cycle, which requires 19 years of patient observation to characterize, represent a kind of scientific patience that modern institutionalized science rarely demands or achieves. The builders of Newark were not primitive people who happened to notice that the moon rose in a slightly different place every year. They were systematic observers who tracked the moon's changing rise point over a 19-year cycle, identified the extremes of that cycle, and built a monument that would preserve the knowledge of those extremes for generations. This is science, not science in the Western academic tradition, but science in the fundamental sense of systematic observation, pattern recognition, and the encoding of discovered patterns in transmissible form. The implications of recognizing this are significant. They force a revision of the picture of scientific knowledge in the pre-Columbian Americas that still influences the way many people think about indigenous cultures. The knowledge of the sky that the ancient builders of North America possessed did not arise from nowhere. It was the product of observation conducted over many generations by many observers, accumulating into a body of knowledge that had real predictive power. The people who aligned the newer octagon to the lunar standstill knew that the moon's extreme rise point would return in 19 years, and they built a monument that would mark its return for their descendants. This is not faith. This is prediction based on observation. This is the exercise of the scientific faculty, and it was not limited to astronomy. The ecological knowledge of the plains peoples, the soil management knowledge of the Amazonian cultures, the hydraulic engineering of the home, the botanical knowledge of the gatherers who knew hundreds of plant species and their properties. All of these represent bodies of empirical knowledge accumulated through systematic observation and transmitted through proven methods. They are not inferior to Western scientific knowledge. They are different in their methods and their goals and their cultural embedding, but they are equally real, equally rigorous in their own terms, and often more comprehensive and more practically applicable to specific environments than the generalized abstractions of Western science. The recognition of indigenous knowledge systems as genuine knowledge systems rather than a superstition or folklore is one of the most important intellectual developments of the past generation. It changes how we think about the pre-Columbian Americas, not just in the past, but in the present. The communities that maintain these knowledge systems today are not preserving mere cultural heritage in the thin sense of maintaining traditions for their own sake. They are maintaining bodies of genuine knowledge that have practical value and that science is increasingly recognizing as significant. The traditional ecological knowledge of specific communities has proven in case after case to be more accurate and more practically useful for the management of specific ecosystems than the generalized models of Western conservation biology. This is the real legacy of ancient America. Not just the mounds and the chambers and the earthworks and the astronomical alignments. As extraordinary as all of those are, the real legacy is the long, patient, intergenerational accumulation of knowledge about how to live on this continent in all its diverse environments, in ways that are sustainable across the long term. The ancient peoples of North America over tens of thousands of years develop this knowledge, and much of it, despite everything, survives in living communities to this day. There is a particular kind of stone wall in the Appalachian Mountains that has been puzzling researchers for decades. It runs across ridgetops and down into valleys and up again over the next ridge for miles at a time, sometimes following the natural contours of the landscape and sometimes crossing them in ways that suggest something other than agricultural intent. These walls are not colonial farm walls, or not only colonial farm walls. Some of them were built before European settlement, and some of them were built by people who were not Europeans. They are in some cases ceremonial enclosures. In others, they appear to mark boundaries, territories, significant places in the landscape. In still others, their purpose remains genuinely unclear. The Appalachian Mountains are one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world. They have been worn down to their present modest heights over hundreds of millions of years, from peaks that once rivaled the Himalayas, and they have been inhabited by human beings for at least 15,000 years through multiple cycles of glaciation and warming, through the extinction of the Pliene megapora and the emergence of the modern ecological communities through the entire span of documented North American prehistory. Whatever happened in the Appalachian, it happened over a very long time. The Cherokee people, whose traditional homeland centered on the southern Appalachians, maintain traditions about the mountains that go back to the earliest times. Their creation stories describe the mountains as emerging from the primordial water. Their oral traditions speak of beings who inhabited the mountains before human beings arrived. Their understanding of specific peaks and valleys and springs and caves as sacred places reflects a relationship with the land that stretches back further than any other form of documentation can reach. In the Cherokee tradition, There are places in the mountains where the world is thin, where the boundary between the world we inhabit and other worlds is permeable, where events in one world can affect events in the other. These places are marked sometimes with stone cans, sometimes with specific plants, sometimes with natural features that have been given names reflecting their spiritual significance. They are not marked on any map that a European cartographer would recognize as authoritative, but they are real places in a landscape that has been inhabited and known and understood by the same tradition for thousands of years. I am not telling you these places are literally doorways to other dimensions. I am telling you that the knowledge encoded in the Cherokee tradition about the Appalachian landscape reflects thousands of years of careful, detailed observation and engagement with that landscape, and that this knowledge is worth taking seriously as a form of geographic and ecological information. The places identified as spiritually significant in indigenous traditions are often, when examined with scientific methods, places of genuine geological or ecological significance. Springs and mineral deposits, and unusual rock formations, and areas of unusual biodiversity often coincide with places identified as sacred in indigenous traditions. The reason for this is not necessarily that ancient peoples had supernatural perception. The reason is that thousands of years of careful observation allows a tradition to identify places where the natural world is doing something unusual, and the available frameworks for recording and transmitting that knowledge may be spiritual rather than scientific, without the underlying observation being any less accurate. The Appalachians are full of these places, full of sites that indigenous traditions have marked as significant, and that modern science is only beginning to characterize. Full of unusual geological features and unusual ecological communities and unusual archaeological deposits that represent the accumulated evidence of 15,000 years of human engagement with a remarkably diverse and productive landscape. And the Appalachians connect through the river systems that drain them in both directions to the rest of the continent, to the Ohio River Valley and the Hopewell trade networks, to the Atlantic coast, and whatever contacts documented and undocumented existed with the Old World, to the Chesapeake Bay and the complex societies that existed there before Jamestown, to the interior Southeast and the Mississippian world that Cahokia anchored. The pre-Columbian Southeast is one of the less well-known but more remarkable regions of ancient North America. At the time of European contact, the Southeast was one of the most densely populated regions north of Mexico, home to a complex web of polities and cultures that the Spanish explorers who moved through the region in the 16th century encountered and documented in ways that are still being analyzed and interpreted today. The Hernando Dotto expedition of 1539 to 1542 was the first major European penetration of the interior Southeast, and the accounts left by its participants describe a landscape full of towns and chiefdoms, and agricultural fields and people, a world of extraordinary complexity and density that bore no resemblance to the empty wilderness that European settlers would find when they moved into the same region a century and 1.5 later. Between Dotto's expedition and the earliest permanent European settlements, the indigenous populations of the Southeast collapsed from an estimated population of several hundred of thousand to a fraction of that, destroyed by the diseases that moved ahead of European settlement faster than the settlers themselves could travel. When the English colonists of the 17th century moved into the Southeast, they were moving into a landscape that had been depopulated within living memory. The fields had reverted to forest, the towns had been abandoned, the mounds that the Mississippian civilization had built were still standing, but the communities that had maintained them and understood them were gone. The colonists saw wilderness. They were actually seeing the aftermath of catastrophe. This pattern repeated across the continent. The wilderness that European settlers believed they were entering. The wild and empty landscape that formed the mythological backdrop for the American frontier. Story was almost everywhere, a post-apocalyptic landscape. The apocalypse had been disease, and it had moved so much faster than European expansion that by the time European settlers arrived in most regions, the indigenous populations had already been reduced by 50 to 90% by epidemics they had never seen, and against which they had no immunity. The emptiness was not natural, it was created. Understanding this changes the meaning of the frontier myth. The story of brave settlers moving into empty wilderness and carving civilization from nothing is a story about people moving into an abandoned civilization and claiming its remains as their own. The farms that European settlers planted were often planted in fields already cleared and worked by indigenous peoples. The paths they followed were indigenous paths. The rivers they navigated had been navigated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The sites they chose for their settlements were often sites where indigenous communities had already established the conditions for human habitation. Clearing the ground, developing water sources, managing the surrounding landscape. None of this is to say that European settlers did nothing or created nothing. They created a great deal, but what they created was built on a foundation that they mostly did not acknowledge and in many cases actively worked to deny. The American founding myth is premised on beginning in a state of nature, on starting fresh from wilderness. But the wilderness was not wilderness, and the starting fresh was not really starting. It was inheriting. The recognition of this inheritance in all its complexity and all its weight is something that American culture is still slowly and painfully working toward. The growing body of archaeological knowledge about pre-Columbian America is part of that working toward. Every discovery that reveals greater complexity and greater sophistication in the ancient American past is a discovery that complicates the founding myth, that makes the claim to a blank slate beginning harder to sustain. That requires a reckoning with what was here before and what happened to it. That reckoning is not complete. It may never be complete, given how much has been permanently lost. But it is underway, and it is producing in archaeology, and in anthropology, and in history, and in law, and in public culture, a slowly shifting picture of what America actually is, of what its deep past actually contains, and of what obligations that past creates for the present. There is a river in the American Southwest called the Colorado, and it has been cutting into the Colorado Plateau for the past 5 to 6 million years, creating the Grand Canyon. If you stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon and look down at the layers of rock exposed by that cutting, you are looking at a cross-section of time that makes all of human history look like a thin smear at the very top. The canyon goes back 2 billion years in places. Human beings have been in North America for 20,000 years, a small fraction of the most recent thin layer, a geological eye-link. This perspective is useful. It reminds us that the human story in the Americas, vast and complex as it is embedded in an Earth story that is vastly longer and vastly more indifferent to the specifics of what we have built and destroyed and forgotten. The mounds will erode, the earthworks will be plowed under, the stone chambers will tumble, the canyon walls will keep being cut indifferently for millions more years. But within the eye-link of human time in the Americas, something remarkable happened. Over 20,000 years or more, human beings learned to inhabit every environment the continent offered. From the Arctic tundra to the tropical rainforest, to the driest desert, they developed languages of extraordinary diversity, more than 1,000 of them spoken at the time of European contact, representing as many different ways of organizing experience in sound and symbol as any comparable geographic area in the world. They developed relationships with the land so intimate and so sustained that the landscape itself became a reflection of human understanding, a physical record of what people had learned about the world they inhabited. And they built things that lasted, things that are still here, still aligned with the stars, still speaking in the language of measurement and proportion and orientation to anyone who knows how to listen. The mounds are still here, the chambers are still here, the earthworks, where they survive, are still here, and the knowledge of how to read them slowly and incompletely is being recovered. This is the deep truth of American prehistory. It was not simple. It was not empty. It was not waiting for civilization to arrive from across the ocean. It was civilization in many forms across many centuries, across an entire continent. And the story of that civilization, strange and vast, and still mostly untold, is one of the great unexplored territories of human history. The stars are the same. The mounds are still here. The questions are still open. Sleep well and dream of ancient things. In the darkness of a long night, the mind moves toward the ancient things. This is not a new observation. It is as old as fire itself. The moment when the practical demands of the day have been met, when shelter has been secured, and food has been eaten, and the children have been settled, the human mind turns toward the larger questions. Where did we come from? What is this place? What does it mean that we are here? What came before us? And what will come after? These are the questions that made the mounds. Not merely practical questions about food storage or defensive positioning, but the great encompassing questions about the meaning of human presence in the world. The people who built Cahokia and Choco and Niwak were not just engineers. They were philosophers, expressing their philosophical vision in the most permanent medium available to them, the earth itself. We know this because the things they built are oriented toward philosophical significance, towards celestial events and cosmological relationships, in ways that purely practical structures would not be. You do not need to align a storage granary with the winter solstice. You do not need to orient a defensive wall to track the lunar standstill cycle. The astronomical orientations of the great works of ancient North America are not accidental. They are the product of a deliberate choice to make the built environment express something about the relationship between human beings and the cosmos they inhabit. This is what the ancient American builders were saying with their mounds and their chambers and their road networks and their earthworks. They were saying that the universe is ordered. They were saying that human beings can perceive that order and can align themselves with it. They were saying that the proper relationship between human life and the cycles of the sun and the moon and the stars is one of harmony, of attentiveness, of building one's life in accordance with the rhythms of a cosmos that is far larger than any individual or any community. These are not trivial things to say. They are in many ways the most important things that human beings can say about their place in the world. And the ancient builders of North America said them in the most lasting way available to them, in structures that have survived 1,000 years and more, still aligned, still oriented, still pointing toward the same stars that the builders watched. There is a kind of conversation happening across time at these sites, between the people who built them and the people who study them across the gulf of centuries. The builders were trying to communicate something about the world. The researchers who study the alignments and the geometries are trying to receive that communication. And what is being communicated across the distance of 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 years is a vision of the cosmos and of human life within it that is different from the vision we have, inherited, but not necessarily less true. The study of ancient American astronomy is in this sense a philosophical enterprise as much as a scientific one. It is an attempt to understand how different people with different tools and different cultural frameworks arrived at different but coherent understandings of the same universe we all inhabit. And what it reveals time after time is that the human capacity for systematic observation, pattern recognition, and the encoding of knowledge in transmissible form is remarkably consistent across cultures and across time. We all see the same sky, we all notice the same cycles, we all in our different ways try to align ourselves with the order we perceive in the universe. But the specific forms that alignment takes are products of specific cultures, specific environments, specific historical trajectories, and the forms that developed in the Americas over tens of thousands of years of continuous development are different from the forms that developed in Europe and Asia. Not inferior, not less sophisticated, different in ways that if we approach them with genuine curiosity and genuine respect, reveal aspects of the universe and of human experience that the Western tradition has not emphasized or has deliberately suppressed. One of those aspects is the relationship between human beings and the rest of the living world. The cosmological systems of most indigenous North American cultures do not place human beings at the top of a hierarchy of being, with the rest of nature existing for human use. They place human beings within a community of living beings, all of which have their own forms of relation, their own ways of knowing, their own relationships with the cosmos. This is not merely a poetic metaphor. It is a serious philosophical position with practical implications for how people live, what they take from the world around them, and how they maintain the conditions for their own long-term survival. The practical wisdom embedded in this philosophical position is becoming increasingly apparent as modern ecological science grapples with the consequences of a centuries-long Western commitment to the opposite position. The idea that nature exists to be used, that the human relationship to the natural world is fundamentally one of mastery and extraction, has produced a civilization of extraordinary material productivity and a planetary ecological crisis of equal extraordinary severity. The indigenous philosophy, which held that human beings are participants in a community of life, rather than managers of a resource, was not simply sentiment. It was a form of ecological wisdom that allowed human beings to live sustainably on the American continent for tens of thousands of years. The ancient builders of North America understood something that Western civilization has largely forgotten and is struggling to remember. They understood that the long-term survival of any human community depends on maintaining the health of the living systems on which that community depends. They understood that the proper relationship between human beings and the natural world is one of reciprocity, of taking what is needed and giving back what is needed, of maintaining the for continued abundance rather than exhausting them for short-term gain. This understanding was encoded in their ceremonies and their cosmologies and their land management practices, and it allowed them to live on this continent in sophisticated and organized ways for a far longer time than any industrial civilization has yet managed. This is the deepest and most important lesson of ancient America, not the specific details of the copper trade or the astronomical alignments or the mound construction techniques, fascinating as all of those are. The deepest lesson is this: human beings can live well on this planet in ways that maintain, rather than destroy, the conditions for human life for very long periods of time. We know this because it happened here, on this continent, for tens of thousands of years. It did not continue forever. The collapses happened. Cahokia fell. Chaco was abandoned. The Huam dispersed. The Amazon cities were emptied. The bison were destroyed. The cultures that had maintained the balance for thousands of years were themselves disrupted, beyond recovery in many cases. The lesson is not that the ancient ways were perfect, or that they produced a utopia immune to all the problems of human nature. The lesson is that the relationship between human beings and the natural world can be maintained in ways that are sustainable across very long periods of time, and that some human communities achieve this over spans of time that dwarf the entire history of industrial civilization. That knowledge is still here, embedded in living traditions, encoded in the landscape, waiting to be more fully understood and more honestly incorporated into the ways we think about the future. Because the future is the point. Ultimately, the study of ancient America is not merely about the past. It is about understanding what human beings are capable of in the longest time scale and the widest geographic range. It is about recovering the knowledge that was built up over tens of thousands of years and that was largely but not completely destroyed in the past 5 centuries. It is about finding in the evidence left behind by the ancient builders the outlines of a different way of being human in the world. The mounds are patient, the alignments are still true, the questions are still open, and the ground from one end of this extraordinary continent to the other still has things to say. There is a particular quality of starlight on a clear night in the American interior, far from cities, in the places where the ancient builders chose to do their most significant work. The stars are thick and close, in a way that people who live in urban areas rarely see. The Milky Way is a river of light. The planets move against the fixed stars in ways that are clearly deliberate, clearly ordered, clearly meaningful in some framework that the eye almost automatically reaches toward, even if the mind does not know how to articulate it. This is what the ancient sky watchers saw. This is the sky that made them astronomers, that made them builders of monuments aligned with celestial events, that made them keepers of 19-year lunar cycles and 2,600-year precession cycles, and the individual risings of specific stars on specific days of the specific year. The sky was their library. It was their calendar. It was in some sense their God, and they engaged with it with a seriousness and a precision and a sustained attention that produced knowledge that is still legible, still accurate, still pointing toward the same places in the same sky that they were pointing toward when the earthworks were built. If you can find a dark sky tonight, look up, not at your phone, not at the ceiling, at the actual sky, the one that has been there above every human being who ever lived on this continent, above every builder and every hunter and every mother and every child who looked up from their fire and wondered what was up there and whether it was watching them. The sky has not changed. The stars have shifted slightly in their positions over the centuries due to the precession of the equinoxes, but the major features are the same. The Milky Way is the same Milky Way. The Pleiades are the same Pleiades. Orion is the same Orion. And somewhere out there in the dark of a night like this one, the ancient builders were lying on their backs and looking up at the same sky, adding another observation to the long record that would eventually tell them exactly where to place a stone, so that the sunrise on the morning of the winter solstice would pass through it in a shaft of light, adding another piece to the knowledge that would eventually allow them to predict 19 years in advance exactly where on the horizon the moon would rise at its maximum northern extreme. They were doing what you are doing right now, looking at the sky, wondering, trying to make sense of the world. They just had more time to do it than we usually allow ourselves, and they embedded what they learned in the earth in ways that have outlasted everything else. They built. That persistence is a kind of message. It is the most durable message ancient America sent to the future. It says, we were here, we paid attention, we understood things about this world we built to last. Look, we are looking, we are listening, and what we are hearing in the measurements of the earthworks and the analysis of the ancient DNA, and the carbon dates from the cave sites and the chemical analysis of the ancient soil and the lyre maps of the buried cities, is something far larger and far stranger and far more wonderful than the story we were given. The deeper we dig into America, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more clearly we can see the outlines of what was actually here. Not an empty land waiting to be discovered, a full world, ancient and complex, still speaking to anyone who stops long enough to listen. The mounds are the voice, the alignments are the language, the ancient sky is the text, and the story it tells. To anyone patient enough to learn to read it, is the story of what human beings actually are when they have enough time and enough humility and enough love for the world they inhabit to pay attention to it across the full span of generations that human culture can sustain. This is what ancient America was. This is what it left behind. This is what we are still imperfectly and incompletely learning to see. Rest now. The ancient places are quiet. The stars are turning above the mounds and the chambers, and the earthworks, and the abandoned city sites, and the desert roads, and the mountain medicine wheels, and the painted caves, turning in the same slow pattern they have always turned in, above every human life that has ever been lived on this continent. Patient, indifferent, beautiful, constant. And somewhere in the dark, under a layer of soil, under a layer of forest, under a layer of grass that looks exactly like the grass around it, something is waiting to be found, something that will change the story again, something that will make the past larger and stranger and more human than we thought it was. The digging continues, the story continues, and somewhere in the dark of the ancient American night, the answers are still down there, waiting for the question. Sleep now. Dream of ancient things. The mounds are patient, they will wait. There is a final mystery we have not yet fully explored, one that sits at the intersection of all the other mysteries we have walked through tonight. It is the mystery of resilience, of how things survive, of how knowledge and culture and identity persist through catastrophe and continue forward into futures that their holders could not have imagined. The indigenous peoples of North America have survived 500 years of sustained, systematic effort to destroy them. This is not hyperbole. The boarding school system, the reservation system, the outlawing of ceremonies, the prohibition of languages, the theft of children, the deliberate destruction of the social and economic foundations of indigenous communities. All of these were policies pursued by the governments of the United States and Canada over a period of more than a century, with the explicit intention of eliminating indigenous cultural identity. They did not succeed. The cultures survived, transformed, damaged, diminished in many ways, but alive. The languages are spoken, the ceremonies are conducted, the knowledge is maintained, the identity persists. This resilience is itself one of the most remarkable facts about North American history. It belongs in the same category as the ancient builders' achievement as evidence of what human beings are capable of when they are committed to something larger than any individual life or any single generation. The people who kept the ceremonies going in secret during the years when they were illegal were making the same kind of commitment that the people who built the mounds over multiple generations made. A commitment to something that extends beyond their own lifetimes, to a continuity of culture and knowledge and identity that can survive the worst that history can throw at it. This is the living inheritance of ancient America, not just the physical sites and the artifacts and the genetic signatures in ancient bones. The living inheritance is the cultures that survived, the languages still spoken, the ceremonies still conducted, the ecological knowledge still applied, the philosophical framework still maintained against all pressure and all inducement to abandon them by communities that understood better than most how much they contained and how much would be lost if they let them go. The connection between the living cultures and the ancient sites is often not direct or simple. The descendants of the Cahokian builders do not have a clear, unbroken genealogy connecting them to the city's golden age. The descendants of the Chacoan architects carry the inheritance of that civilization in modified and transformed ways that reflect 1,000 years of subsequent history. But the connection is real. The knowledge that built Cahokia and Chaco did not disappear when those cities were abandoned. It transformed, adapted, was carried in new directions by the people who moved on from those places. And the cultures that can be traced from those ancient traditions to the present day carry in, however modified a form, the deep inheritance of what was built and known and understood in those ancient centers. The Hopi people of Arizona maintain a ceremonial calendar that has been kept continuously for centuries, perhaps millennia. The cycle of dances and ceremonies they conduct across the year marks the same solar events, the same solstices and equinoxes that the builders of Cho embedded in the alignments of their great houses. The connection is real. The knowledge is the same knowledge expressed in different but related forms, maintained in a living tradition that links the present moment to a past that stretches back further than any written record can reach. When Hopi elders speak about the responsibilities of their community to the land they inhabit, they are not merely invoking tradition for its own sake. They are drawing on a body of practical and philosophical knowledge about the relationship between human communities and the natural world that has been tested across many centuries and has proven its worth. The knowledge that the Hopi maintain about the proper way to live in the sauna and desert, about the management of water in an arid landscape, about the relationship between human action and ecological consequence, is knowledge that their ancestors paid a very high price to acquire through the trial and error of survival in a demanding environment across many generations. This knowledge deserves to be heard. It deserves to be taken seriously as knowledge, not merely as culture or tradition or heritage. It deserves the same epistemic respect that we give to the knowledge produced by Western science, not because it is identical to Western science, but because it represents a genuine form of systematic human inquiry into the nature of the world and the conditions for human flourishing within it. The same is true of the knowledge maintained by every indigenous community in North America, the knowledge of the Tlingit about the ecology of the Pacific Northwest coast, the knowledge of the Anishinaabe about the management of the Great Lakes forests, the knowledge of the Lakota about the ecology of the Great Plains, the knowledge of the Ojibwe about the medicinal properties of the plants of the boreal forest. All of this is knowledge real and valuable, and often irreplaceable, maintained by living communities across the long disruptions of the past 5 centuries. The destruction of that knowledge wherever it has occurred is not only a tragedy for the communities that held it, it is a loss for all of humanity. It is a loss of data, of observational records, of theoretical frameworks for understanding the living world that cannot be reconstructed by any amount of Western scientific research, because the research conditions the thousands of years of observation from within a specific place cannot be replicated. We are living in a period when this understanding is growing, when ecologists are increasingly recognizing the value of indigenous knowledge systems as supplements and correctives to the generalized models of Western conservation biology, when archaeologists are increasingly incorporating oral tradition into their interpretive frameworks rather than dismissing it as mere mythology, when geneticists are increasingly consulting with indigenous communities about the interpretation of ancient DNA findings that concern their ancestors, when lawyers and courts are increasingly recognizing indigenous territorial and cultural rights that previous generations ignored or denied, this growing recognition is not yet complete. It is contested and uneven. There are still contexts in which indigenous knowledge is dismissed and indigenous rights are denied. The story of the relationship between Western civilization and the indigenous peoples of the Americas is not a story with a resolved ending. It is an ongoing story still being written, with outcomes that are still genuinely uncertain. But the direction of movement in the slow accumulation of legal precedent and scientific recognition and cultural reckoning is toward a greater acknowledgement of what the ancient Americas actually contained, and what the living heirs of that ancient world actually know and actually are owed. The mounds are still here, the chambers are still here, the earthworks where they have not been destroyed are still here, the alignments are still true. And the people who are descended from the builders who carry in their traditions and their languages and their ceremonies the inheritance of what was built and known and sustained across tens of thousands of years are also still here. This is the deepest truth of the American mystery, not the gaps in the academic record, not the unexplained anomalies in the archaeological data, not the contested origins and the missing copper and the mummies with tobacco residue. The deepest truth is that this continent was for an incomprehensibly long time home to remarkable human beings who built remarkable things and knew remarkable things, and whose descendants are still here, still carrying that inheritance, still living in the same landscape that their ancestors managed and understood, and expressed their relationship to stone and earth and sky. The story of ancient America is not only a story about the past, it is a story about the present, about what is still here, about what still survives, about what still speaks in stone and in ceremony and in living tradition to anyone who listens. And listening, as the night grows late and the mind loosens its grip on the day's ordinary concerns and drifts toward the larger and older things, is perhaps the most important skill we can develop in relation to the ancient American past. Not just the listening of archaeological analysis, with its measurements and its dates and its chemical signatures, the listening of genuine attention, of willingness to be surprised, of openness to a world that is larger and stranger and older and more full of human achievement than the familiar story prepared us for. The mounds are patient. They have been here for 1,000 years, and they will be here for another 1,000. The stars are constant. They have watched over every human life that has ever been lived on this continent, and they will watch over many more. The questions are still open, and somewhere in the dark of the ancient American night, the answers are still down there, waiting for the people willing to dig deep enough to find them. Rest now. Let the day go. The ancient continent is quiet around you, full of everything that was built and everything that was known and everything that was lost, and everything that survived. Full of mounds that looked like hills, and chambers that looked like cellars, and roads that looked like paths, and earthworks that looked like nothing at all, unless you know what you are looking at. Full of knowledge encoded in stone alignments, and botanical traditions, and astronomical observations, and oral narratives, and living ceremonies. Full of the long, patient record of human beings doing what human beings do, which is to look at the world they inhabit, try to understand it, and build something that expresses that understanding. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more clearly we can see the outlines of the world that was here before the world we inherited. Large, complex, sophisticated, ancient, and in some ways more wise about the long-term conditions for human flourishing than anything that has come since. Sleep well, the mounds are patient, the stars are turning, and the story continues. There is one more thing to say before the night is fully given over to silence. We have traveled a long way tonight across time, and across the continent, from the shores of Lake Superior to the canyons of the Southwest, from the mounds of the Mississippi Valley to the stone chambers of New England, from the ancient copper mines to the aligned earthworks, to the oral traditions that carry forward the memory of a world that in so many of its specific forms no longer exists. And throughout this journey, the question underlying everything we have discussed has been a simple one. What are we missing? What don't we know? What would we find if we looked more carefully, asked more honestly, listened more attentively to the stones and the stars and the living traditions that have survived? What parts of the story are still down there, under the earth, or encoded in ancient ceremonies, or preserved in the memories of elders in communities we have not yet thought to ask? The honest answer is that we are missing a great deal. The story of ancient America is a story still very much in its early chapters, as far as scientific understanding is concerned. The LiDAR surveys of the past decade have revealed more in 10 years than the previous century of ground-level archaeology. The ancient DNA work of the past decade has rewritten the story of American population history in ways that previous generations of researchers could not have anticipated. And the work of ethnobiologists and traditional knowledge researchers and legal scholars working with indigenous communities has revealed bodies of knowledge and frameworks of understanding that the dominant academic culture had almost entirely ignored. The pace of discovery is accelerating. The tools are getting better. The questions are getting more sophisticated. The willingness of the mainstream academic establishment to take anomalous evidence seriously, while still not perfect, is greater than it was a generation ago. The willingness of indigenous communities to engage with archaeological and genetic research on terms that respect their sovereignty and their interpretive authority is also growing. The conditions for genuine discovery, real discovery that changes our understanding in fundamental ways, are better now than they have ever been. What will be found in the next decade, we cannot know, but based on the trajectory of the past decade, based on the pattern of discovery that has consistently revealed a larger, more complex, more ancient, and more sophisticated American past than any model predicted, the bet that something extraordinary is coming seems like a reasonable one. The next LAR survey of the right area will reveal something unexpected. The next ancient DNA study from the right sample will add another twist to the story of American population history. The next careful ethnographic study of the right indigenous knowledge tradition will reveal something about the past that no amount of conventional archaeology could have found. This is the state of American archaeology and prehistory in our time. An enterprise on the edge of something large, gathering tools and questions and data with the sense that the next excavation, the next survey, the next sample will be the one that changes everything again. And in that state of expectancy, there is something comforting, something that says the world is not finished, the past is not fully known, the story is not over. There are still things to find, still things to understand, still things to be surprised by. The mounds are still giving up their secrets. The stars are still telling their stories to anyone who learns to read the alignment. And the ancient continent, in all its strange and vast complexity, is still waiting to be more fully known. This is why the mysteries of ancient America matter, not just as historical puzzles, though they are that, not just as scientific questions, though they are that too. They matter because they remind us that the world is larger than we know, that the human past is deeper and more various and more full of achievement than any single story can contain, that there have been many ways of being human on this earth, and many of them were remarkable, and many of them are still here in the landscape and in the living traditions of the peoples who maintain them. Sleep now. The ancient places are around you in whatever landscape you inhabit. The mounds are patient, the stars are turning, and somewhere in the dark of the deep American night, the story of what was here before continues, quietly in stone and ceremony, and the long memory of the earth. Good night. There is something worth holding on to in these final moments before sleep takes you. Something about scale, and about time, and about what it means to be alive in a world as old and as full as this one. We forget most days that we are standing on ancient ground. We forget that the soil beneath the sidewalk and the parking lot and the foundation of the building contains the traces of everything that happened here before the present world was built over it. We forget that the rivers we cross on bridges were once crossed on foot or by canoe, by people who knew their currents and their moods and their seasonal changes in ways that no engineer survey has ever captured. We forget that the forests we drive through on highways were once managed landscapes shaped by the knowledge and intention of communities that had been working that ground for generations before a European eye ever saw it. We forget, but the ground remembers. The alignments hold, the stones are still in place. And somewhere always, there is a researcher with a question and a tool and the particular kind of patience that archaeology demands, working slowly and carefully through the evidence, adding one more piece to a picture that grows larger and stranger with every discovery. The past is not finished with us. It is still speaking in the landscape, and in the living traditions, and in the slow accumulation of scientific understanding. And if we are quiet enough, if we can set down for a moment the noise and urgency of the present, we can almost hear it. The ancient continent breathing sleep. Now there is a word in the Lakota language, mitaku oasin, that is sometimes translated as, we are, all related, or all my relations. It is spoken as a prayer, as an acknowledgement, as a statement of philosophical position about the nature of the world. It says that the relationship between human beings and every other being in the world is a relationship of kinship, of connection, of mutual belonging. It says that we are not separate from the world we inhabit. We are part of it, related to it, responsible to it. This is what the ancient builders of North America were saying with their mounds and their alignments and their roads and their managed landscapes. Mitaku oasin. We are all related. The stars and the earth and the living things and the human communities and the generations past and the generations to come, all related, all part of the same story, all worth paying attention to, all worth remembering. The mounds are patient, the stars are constant, the story continues, and you lying in your bed on your small patch of the ancient continent are part of it too. Sleep well. There is one last thing, the horizon. Every morning it is there, wherever you are in the world, the place where the earth meets the sky. The ancient continent holds its breath and waits, as it has always waited, as it will always wait. The mounds are patient, the mystery,